I saw it. I know you will. Just listen. It started when I was in Japan. I've been living with a host family for a few months, and my semester abroad was almost over. I had the nerve to believe I'd begun to acclimate, that I understood their culture and could call myself one of them. On more than a few nights gathered around the fire, they told me their superstitions and scary stories. Their myths were very different from the ones I'd grown up with, and I found them fascinating, but not scary. And they were different too. There was a heavy emphasis on choice. Rather than facing a mindless slasher that simply wanted to kill you, many Japanese horror stories involved entities approaching an unwary victim in a public place and giving them a choice. If the victim answered one way, they would be killed horribly in a specific manner. If the victim took the other choice, they would be killed horribly in another specific manner. These unwinnable situations made me laugh until the father of my host family explained to me, in quiet tones, the true subtext. It was all about the third option. It was all about the innate fear of customs in a very traditional society. The only way to survive was to simply know the acceptable third answer and give that one instead. He squeezed my arm and told me that I, as a foreigner, stood no chance of knowing the third answer. If I saw someone approaching me in public, no matter how innocent it seemed, I was to run away before they could speak and give me that fatal choice. I smiled and laughed it off, but his warning made me shiver a few times over the last few days. As a girl alone in another country, I was already on guard while walking through public spaces, but the towering maze of Tokyo took on a gray and tense tone whenever I thought of what might lurk in the crowds. I stuck to paths that went through the many hidden gardens and parks, and I always looked around warily. That fear faded, though. I can't tell you why exactly. I was young. I thought I was smart, and I was American. Nothing could really hurt me. And besides, I was one of them now, right? I'd spent months there living like they did. So, on my last day, when a woman began walking intently toward me from the opposite end of a long subway car, I stayed in my seat. She had long black hair, beautiful dark eyes, and a dark green dress that seemed out of place in a crowded car otherwise filled with gray shirts, dark suits, and white blouses. I saw these details about her before I saw the deep scars on her face and hands, as if a maniacal American slasher had brutally carved her up and left her to die some years ago. As she shuffled toward me, the lights flickered once. The boy in the seat next to me shivered and focused worriedly on his portable game. Adults looked away, tense, and the teenager opposite me finally stopped talking and began staring at their shoes. They knew. They knew, and there was nothing any of them could or would do for me. I was a foreigner and a stranger to them. But they listened. Oh, did they listen? I could almost hear them straining their ears to hear her whispers over the keening of wheels on rails beneath us. Every small step the woman took seemed louder than the one before. Even then, I still didn't believe. I thought it was a prank or someone being strange. I thought the others in the car with me were turning away out of courtesy or disgust at her scars. When I saw a tear fall from the cheek of the boy next to me, when I saw it splatter onto his game screen while he continued to pretend to play, that's when I understood. She stood directly above me, and I raised my eyes to meet hers. Her scars crinkled horribly as she gave me a seemingly innocent smile, and she asked in a pleasant but whispery voice, "Do you have a sister?" I froze. If I said yes, what would happen? If I said no, what else would happen? When the lights flickered again, and her face moved without moving right down close to mine, I almost panicked and told her the truth. Inches away from me, her smile widened. She turned her head slowly, horribly slowly, until her neck reached a 90-degree angle. On the verge of passing out from fright, I forced myself to start breathing again. Her smile turned into an angry frown. I cowered back against the person behind me, who shrieked, the scarred woman in green began to reach for me, but the car came to a smooth stop, the doors open, and I dodged around her and ran out with the crowd. To their credit, none screamed. They simply hurried off to their various destinations while attempting to seem like nothing was wrong. Nobody wanted to draw attention to themselves. Nobody wanted to get noticed by the woman in green or by polite society. I ran all the way to my host family's house, but nobody was home. It was my last day, and we'd already said our goodbyes, but it still felt odd that they were gone. Still trembling, I took a taxi to the airport, made my flight, and tried to rationalize the encounter away. The only hint I had that it had even happened was a small cut on my upper arm where she had nearly grabbed me with her horrible long nails, a cut that had, strangely, already begun to heal into a scar. Hours into my international flight, I finally began to calm down, and I even started feeling a bit smug. Not only had I survived an encounter with a Japanese horror entity, I'd even managed to immediately take a flight straight the hell out of the entire country. I would not end up as another unwitting cautionary tale. I was a born and bred American girl that had seen every horror movie under the sun, and I'd made all the right decisions. Awesome. I told the story to a guy sitting next to me on my flight, and he asked, "What if she shows up here on the plane? Where will you run?" Yeah, I shut up right about then, and stayed tense for the next few hours. Eventually, though, I realized I would be doomed no matter what if the woman in the green dress showed up here, so I finally gave in and slept. Awake or asleep, it didn't matter. My neighboring guy woke me up before we landed, joked that he'd kept guard, and reported that nobody had come for me while I'd been out. Half-heartedly thanking him, I made polite conversation, left the plane, got my stuff, and met my parents outside the airport. It was bright, sunny, and open here, and it was a relief to be back home. This was the land of simple horrors, of gory violence, zombies, and haunted locations. The scarred woman in the green dress would have no power here, if indeed she existed at all. I was talkative and happy on the ride home, and my parents were glad to see me. I didn't tell them about my horrible encounter, because it honestly slipped from my mind. Everything was good. I was safe. We pulled up to the house where I'd grown up, and it looked exactly like I'd remembered. Only a few months had gone by, true, but it felt like a lifetime ago. Lugging in my stuff alongside my dad, I began to recount some funny memory that had come to mind when I entered the front door, turned toward the kitchen, and saw her standing there. Green dress, scars, smile and all, the woman from the subway car thousands of miles distant stood waiting for me in my childhood home. She gave me that same eerie smile and lifted a large knife. I screamed and dropped my bags. Startled, my father dropped his too, and my mother rushed in from outside. The woman in green brought the knife down. She raised it, then brought it down again, chopping vegetables. Mistaking my reaction, my mother began screaming with me, but happily, and she pulled me forward. "It's good to see your sister again, isn't it?" Suddenly, I was forced into a hug with both my mother and the woman in green. But instead of trying to hurt me, the horrible stranger just smiled. "It's good to see you, sis." I pulled away, trembling forcefully. I immediately sensed that something was off, and I'd seen enough movies to know to keep my cards close to my chest. "Mom, what's going on?" "What do you mean, honey?" she asked, smiling happily at both of us before moving deeper into the kitchen to help cook. The scarred woman in green kept her gaze and neutral smile fixated on me as I moved away from her, around the kitchen island and toward my mother. "Why is she here?" "Who?" "Her." I returned the woman's stare. My mother laughed. "You've been away too long, dear. You remember that your sister's graduated and back from college now." I gulped. "Humor me, Mom. Why doesn't she look like us?" My father came down the stairs, returning from dropping off my bags, and gave me a blank look. "I thought we were past this. It's not nice to keep harping on your sister for being adopted." Horrified, I took a step back and bumped into the fridge. But how? "Oh, I guess I'm just super jet-lagged. Sorry, I was just trying to remember when that was, for a birthday present for her and all." My father sighed. "Same day you were born." He stepped out to get more bags from the car. I turned away, mortified. My sister never took her gaze off of me, almost taunting me with her expressionless invasion. As we both stood there, facing off silently, she lifted her knife and brought it down, on her own arm, right along one of her scars. She didn't flinch. Instead, I did. Gripping my arm and looking down, I saw the skin slice open, bleed, heal, and fade into a scar in moments. Aghast, I looked at her and saw the equivalent cut disappearing from her arm. Her smile grew a little wider. I opened my mouth to scream something with fury, but the scarred woman lifted a knife and pointed at my mother's back. The implication was clear. The best I could do was to take the knife from her by offering to cook and insisting that my sister sit down at the table and relax. She did so, apparently willing to play a social game of cat and mouse. As I chopped up vegetables and stared at the scar on my arm, my thoughts raced. This entity had somehow attached itself to my life. Looking around at pictures in the kitchen, I saw her in photographs that I recognized. Family photos that now included her, as a child, as a teenager, as a woman, scarred from the outset. I kept my eyes on her as she sat at the table, and she stared right back at me the entire time. Her disfigured smile never once changed. We actually sat down and had dinner as a family. My parents didn't seem to notice that my sister never spoke unless directly addressed, and even then only with perfect politeness. She ate little and kept her eyes always on me. Halfway through dinner, I got angry and slammed my fist on the table. She took her dinner knife and drew it across her cheek. I fought hard not to scream as I felt my face split open, bleed, and then heal. I already knew there would be a scar, but I excused myself to go to the bathroom and look for myself. Once there, it occurred to me that the leech, a leech on my life, time, and soul, seemed to be punishing me for rudeness. I remember saying to the mirror, "All right, you bitch, I'll play your game." I just needed time to figure out. Another slice opened up near my ear, bled, and quickly healed over into a scar. She'd heard me from the dining room, or she could hear me no matter what. Walking carefully back into the dining room, I put on my best graces and sat with a smile. I couldn't think about the scars. Were they permanent? Would I live the rest of my life disfigured? Plastic surgery might fix a few, but if this kept going, no. I would just have to be polite and proper until I could figure out how to destroy her. I volunteered to help clean up dinner and do the dishes, and my mother seemed surprised, saying that my time in Japan had done me good. I didn't know what she meant by that, but I managed to get through the evening without any further scars. That night, I tried to whisper to my father in the dark, but he didn't understand what I meant, and I earned another scar on my arm. I slipped downstairs and into her room. My sister sat holding a knife to her arm and grinning wider than I'd ever seen. "What do you want?" I asked her. She held the knife higher on her arm, just above a clear patch of skin where her scars had left her and been transferred to me. "Do you have a sister?" Suddenly remembering the moment of mortal threat in the subway car, I said nothing. She didn't cut herself, but she did wait, always staring, ever staring. I backed out and went to my own bedroom, where I laid stressed for hours. I did sleep eventually, but only because jet lag forced me into it. The next few days were filled with terribly costly chess moves. I invited over old friends to see if they recognized her as my sister, and they did. For each of these conversations with confused friends, I earned another scar. The leech knew what I was trying to do, and she disapproved. The worst part was running into an ex-boyfriend and finding out that he didn't remember our relationship. After much pressure, he finally admitted, "I liked your personality, but I didn't ask you out because of your scars. Sorry." I remember screaming and earning another scar for it. Rushing home, I looked at old yearbook pictures. The scars weren't just appearing now, they were appearing back then too. I'd always had them. That same ex-boyfriend would later remember asking out my sister instead. The leech was draining away my life right before my eyes. What would happen when she ran out of scars and I had them all? I couldn't talk to my parents. I couldn't talk to my friends. I shut myself in my room and spent each day alone to avoid any further social improprieties. I've been raised American, raised rude, proud, and free, and I kept making mistakes. It was in me to swear, to nettle, and to tease, and the cost was just too high. My host family's father had been right. I was losing because I was from the wrong culture. Had I been a traditional and proper Japanese girl, the leech might never have punished me, even once. The leech existed to punish deviants. The leech fed off of outsiders, rebels, and bad children. The leech was part of me now. She only had a few scars left when the idea came to me. She had this huge asinine grin all the time now, and stood in my room while I slept, staring at me, basically daring me to say something rude. She held a knife over me while I slept. Yes, but it was not to cut me. It was to cut herself. And that's what gave me the idea. Furious and desperate beyond description, I decided that I wanted my life back at any cost. I've been thinking of the leech in two ways. I could avoid being rude and live under her threat for the rest of my life, or I could be myself and find out what punishment awaited once all the scars had been inflicted upon me. I feared the second option. I was terrified. When the leech became clear and beautiful, and I became horrid and misshapen, what would she do to me? Would she kill me? Discard me when I stopped being useful? Would I cease to exist altogether? Would my life completely become hers? I've been so afraid of that second option, it took me until she only had one scar left to remember what my benefactor had said. There was a third option, one unknowable to any but the most socially integrated, and I had enough time to see that, for the leech, the social game went both ways. We were not in Japan. We were in America. Here, victims got tough when the end was nigh. She was with me always then. She walked directly behind me, goading me, irritating me, pushing me with her silence and her grin. Oh, that perfect smile and that beautiful face. It mocked me. I stood in the kitchen with her, and I drew out the same knife she had been holding when I'd first come home and found her attached to my life and timeline like the horrific leech she was. I smiled at her, matching her expression, and I brought the knife down before she could react. Not on her, on myself. I slashed open my arm, and blood splattered across the kitchen island. She gasped and pulled back, her hair hiding her face. I saw her clutch her arm, and I saw a scar appear in the equivalent place where I had slashed myself. I wasn't healing, but I had actually managed to injure her. I thought long and hard about it. Cutting her would only mean cutting myself, but cutting myself meant cutting her. I slashed again, this time on my face. She screamed. Finally, God, I'd long prayed to hear that noise from her. I slashed again on my leg, and she fell to her knees. My blood splattered across her green dress, soiling it, and I slashed myself again and again and again. I fell faint, and still I cut myself, turning my arms, legs, face, and tummy into oozing mincemeat and gobs of flesh. With each strike, she screamed louder and crumpled further. I fell to my knees before her, a wall of pain and ebbing gore, and I smiled at her as her scream reached a crescendo that soared into nothingness. With a last gasp, she shrank and blackened until she became nothing more than a grasping little animal, an actual leech. Without a person to latch onto, she was nothing but a worm. With the last of my strength, I stood up and stomped on her. It was over. I called 911 after that, of course, and, equally as expected, you think I'm crazy, but you have to listen. She was real, but she's gone now, and I'm not going to do this again. I killed her. I know I'll be scarred all over, just like she was, but at least I'll get to live. I'll get to swear, I'll get to drink, I'll get to... Remorse? For what? Why are you asking me that question? Find the guy on the plane. He'll tell you what I told him. No way he'd forget. You're not hearing me. Find anyone who was on the subway that day, in my car. They'll teach you. Why do you keep saying that? Stop asking me that question. She was a leech. She took everything that should have been mine. If she'd just never been adopted, it would have been my life. That would have been my friends, my boyfriend, my prom date. She was always there, always in my goddamn house, always so much better than me, always mocking me with that beautiful face. I don't have a sister.
I was lucky enough to be born on an island just off of Japan called Okinawa. I attended public school, and while many of the years were great, there was one horrible night that I would never forget. At the time, I was only 11 years old, and my class was going through Japanese history, and we happened to come across a creepy story about a forest on the mainland called the Okigahara Forest, or better known today as the Suicide Forest. Our teacher filled our heads with horrific stories of the mainland and how we were lucky to live on post at Camp Henson. As the son of a Marine, I lived on post with the other military brats. Although we had our teacher and our ear telling us how lucky we were, we all had horror stories of our own. But there was one story that we told that frightened even the bravest of us. The demon in the woods. Just off post was a large forest that, at the time, the military left alone. The kids in my class had come up with a story that not even the Marines would dare enter the forest, in fear that they would be killed by the demon, and their bodies would be dragged out into the woods to be devoured and never seen again. I, of course, believed this to be bull. I called out those kids, Martin Fox and James Pruitt, telling them that they were full of it, and that nothing was in those woods except the animals that lived there. Well, of course, Martin and James didn't like being called liars, so they said, "Oh yeah? How do you know?" And I said that Marines aren't afraid of anything, and that one would be more than enough to handle an army of demons. I thought this mostly because one of my dad's favorite sayings was, "Regroup hell," so I figured that if they would regroup in hell, surely they wouldn't be afraid of any demon, right? James busted out with the mother of all challenges. "Prove it. I triple dog dare you to go into the woods." He completely skipped the double dog dare, the bastard. So of course, I had to accept. It was only walking into the woods. So I agreed, but Martin wasn't done. He added the stipulation that it had to be at night. Late at night. I couldn't very well back down now. so I agreed to their terms. I waited until my parents were fast asleep, and I hopped on my Huffy and rode out to the meeting place off post. I was silently hoping that Martin and James would chicken out, but to my dismay, there they were, waiting, flashlights and all. When I rode up, I hopped off my bike and held out my hand for one of their flashlights. "No flashlights. You have to go in the dark," James said. "That's not part of the dare," I protested, half wanting to chicken out of the whole thing. "Chicken," Martin responded, adding a few clucks and waving of his arms. Screw these guys, I thought. So I let my bike hit the road, and I marched off into the woods, listening to their jeers from behind. "Don't forget 100 steps," Martin yelled. I didn't respond, and just clicked my teeth and made my way into the forest, step after step. The brush was pretty thick, and after a while, I couldn't even make out the glow of their flashlights behind me. The treetops blocked the moonlight, so it was almost pitch black. So I just kept walking until I hit that 100 steps, and silently congratulated myself. My success would be short-lived. I spotted what looked like a white flash out of the corner of my eye, and I immediately turned, fully expecting to spot Martin or James trying to scare me. "I know that's you guys," I called out, but there was no response. I stood quietly for a moment, hoping to spot one of them make the mistake of using the flashlight again, but nothing came. That's when I heard it, the sound of a twig breaking directly behind me. I turned around to try and catch the bastards, but what I felt wasn't a small kid, but a huge figure towering over me. "You smoke," a voice whispered in the dark, breaking the silence. His voice sent chills down my spine. I wasn't going to stick around to find out who or what said that. I turned and booked it. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, hoping that I wasn't going to be followed. I ended up tripping and knocking myself out. Cliché, I know, but it was pitch black. The next thing I know, I start to regain consciousness, and I can feel myself being dragged by my feet. I couldn't move. I couldn't cry out. I couldn't do anything. I was solely at the mercy of whatever it was that was dragging me along, and I lost consciousness again. The next time I opened my eyes, it was the sun rising that greeted me. I sat up and realized that I was sitting in my front yard. I looked around and couldn't figure out how I had gotten there. Martin and James probably dragged me back, so I just ran inside and got ready for school. I decided it was best not to let my parents know that I had snuck out, in fear of the whooping I would probably get. When I got to school, Martin and James were crying to our teacher, Mrs. Day, that I was taken by the demon, and when I walked in the classroom, they were absolutely shocked to see me there. It was at that moment that I realized that they weren't the ones who brought me home. So how the hell did I end up back on post? Who knew where I lived? It wasn't until many years later that I overheard my dad telling my nephew a horror story about Camp Henson. An old World War II Marine that had been killed in battle roamed the base at night, and sometimes he would approach people and say, "Got a light?" And after getting his cigarette lit, he would vanish into thin air. When I heard that story, I knew how I got home.
A 19-year-old girl was attending university in Japan. In her second year of study, she decided that she wanted to improve her English, so she transferred to a university in the United States. She had always wanted to live in the USA, but she did not anticipate how difficult the change would be for her. The course she was studying required her to submit a lot of reports. While she was attending the university in Japan, she submitted all her reports in Japanese. However, in the American university, all of the reports had to be in English. This caused a big problem for the girl because her command of the English language was not very good. She found that she had to spend hours upon hours checking the spelling and grammar while typing up her reports. Another problem was that she didn't own a laptop. Luckily, the university library had a computer lab with approximately 50 computers that was open 24 hours a day. Unfortunately, there were always long queues of people waiting to use them. Every morning, she had to attend lectures, and every evening, she had to queue for a computer. This all took its toll, and after a while, the girl became fed up with the daily grind. Late one night, after the Japanese girl had been sitting hunched over a computer for hours, she began to get restless. It was almost 2 a.m. and she was extremely tired. It was getting difficult for her to keep her eyes open. Leaning back in her chair, she yawned and stretched out her arms in front of her. Her fingers happened to nudge the computer keyboard aside. She was about to begin typing again when she happened to glance down and noticed that there was something scratched into the desk under the keyboard. It seemed to be an internet URL. She thought it was odd that someone had taken the time to engrave a website address in the wood, and out of a combination of curiosity and boredom, she decided to look it up. After typing the website address into the browser, she waited a few seconds and a page appeared on the screen. What she saw horrified her. There was a picture of a man covered in blood lying on the floor of a dimly lit room. It looked so real that it turned her stomach and made her feel like throwing up. Looking closely, she saw a caption below the image. It read, "Dumb guy aged around 30, killed by me today." A chill went down her spine as she stared at the gruesome picture. The girl immediately shut down her computer and, grabbing her handbag, she hurried out of the computer lab. She returned to her dorm room alone and spent the night tossing and turning in bed. The horrible photo she had seen was never far from her mind. Could it be real? She asked herself. Maybe it's just a hoax. People post crazy pictures on the internet all the time. The web is full of weird and disturbing websites. Try as she might, the girl couldn't shake the sneaking suspicion that she had stumbled across the website of a murderer. Worst of all, he seemed to be boasting about his crime. The next morning after breakfast, her curiosity got the better of her. She skipped her first lecture and headed straight for the computer labs. When she found a free computer, she sat down, typed in the URL, and held her breath. Perhaps what she had seen last night was just her imagination. When the website appeared, she saw that the image had changed. Instead of a dead body in a dimly lit room, the photo showed a blonde woman walking down a busy street. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. The picture appeared to have been taken from a distance, and the woman seemed unaware that she was being photographed. The caption underneath read, "Stupid woman, around 25 years old." That evening, the girl went back to her dorm room and didn't speak to anyone. She was still unnerved and couldn't stop thinking about the strange website. As soon as she woke up the next morning, she dressed and went back to the computer lab. There was hardly anyone around. She sat down at a free computer and typed in the website URL. To her horror, the image had changed again. It was the same dimly lit room, but this time a blonde woman lay on the floor. Blood was flowing from her nose and mouth. There was a large knife sticking out of her chest. Under the photo were the words, "Stupid woman, around 25 years old, killed by me today." The girl was horrified and immediately contacted the police. Over the phone, it was difficult for her to explain the situation. Her English was not very good, and she spent a long time repeating herself and trying to find the right words to describe what she had found. In the end, she wasn't even sure if the police had understood what she was trying to say. However, they took her name, address, phone number, and the URL of the website. When she hung up the phone, the girl was shaking. She couldn't seem to get the awful pictures out of her mind. She had to take another look. That evening, she returned to the computer lab again and, with mixed feelings of fear and curiosity, she entered the URL of the website. When the page loaded, she discovered that the image that had been there just a few hours before was gone. Instead, there was a picture of a girl taken from behind. She had short black hair, a lime green t-shirt, and was sitting in front of a computer. The girl got a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, and she broke out into a cold sweat. She recognized the hair. She recognized the clothes. She was staring at a picture of herself. Her name, address, and phone number were written under the picture, followed by a single sentence: "You are my next internet star." The Japanese girl ran out of the computer lab and went straight back to her dorm room. She packed up her belongings, and by the next morning, she was on a flight back to Japan. She never returned to the United States again.
One of my relatives passed away suddenly. I never met the woman. She had a daughter who was 4 years old. The little girl's name was Yuki. Her father wasn't able to raise her on his own, so he asked my aunt to care for her. The little girl refused to be left alone and never left my aunt's side. It started to become a problem. My aunt couldn't go anywhere without Yuki. She constantly needed attention. Even my aunt's own daughter started to get jealous. One day, my aunt told me she had to go out of town for a couple of days and asked if I would babysit the little girl for her. I said it would be my pleasure. I lived alone and I could do with some company. A few days later, my aunt dropped Yuki off in my apartment. As she was leaving, she took the little girl aside and said, "Yuki, please be good. Behave yourself." When my aunt was gone, I tried to talk to Yuki and play some games with her, but the little girl's behavior was very strange. She had a teddy bear tucked tightly under her arm and would never let go of it. She never smiled. She never spoke. All she ever did was sit quietly in the corner and stare at the wall. It made me kind of uneasy. I was trying to find something that would entertain her. I had just bought a new digital camera and decided to let Yuki play with my old one. When she saw the camera, her eyes lit up. I showed her how to use it and she went all around my apartment, taking pictures of everything. There was a bright smile on her face. That evening, I discovered how difficult Yuki was to deal with. Whenever I tried to leave the room, she started crying and screaming out my name. I couldn't leave her alone or she would create a huge fuss. She even insisted on going with me to the bathroom, which was very embarrassing. At bedtime, she refused to stay in the spare room and insisted on sleeping in my bed. I read her a bedtime story and after a while, I managed to get her to go to sleep. But that was when I noticed her teddy bear. One of its legs was charred and blackened, as if it had been burned. It made me wonder. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by a strange noise. When I turned over, I saw that there was something wrong with Yuki. The little girl's body was trembling and shaking. Her eyes were wide open. Her teeth were chattering and tears were streaming down her cheeks. I held her close and asked her what was wrong. "She's looking at me again," she mumbled. "Who is?" I asked in surprise. "The dark woman," replied Yuki. She wouldn't say anything more. I tried to tell her it was just her imagination, but she kept shaking her head and whimpering. It took me a long time to get her to go back to sleep. The next day, Yuki was fine again. She loved playing with my digital camera. When it was time for her to go home, I told her she could keep it. Yuki hugged me. Although she didn't say anything, I could tell she was overjoyed. I dropped the little girl off at my aunt's house and stayed to have a cup of tea. My aunt thanked me for taking care of Yuki, and we spent a while chatting at the kitchen table. "Poor little thing," said my aunt. "She hasn't said a word since her mother died." I couldn't contain my curiosity. "How did Yuki's mom die?" I asked. A strange look came over my aunt's face. "She died in a fire." "How did the fire start?" I asked. "Well," my aunt hesitated, unwilling to talk about it. "It's a very sad story. She committed suicide. Yuki's mother was a very troubled woman. She poured gasoline over herself and lit a match. She burned herself alive. "Oh my God," I exclaimed. "How horrible." "Yes," said my aunt. Her family was so shocked. They hushed it up and pretended it was an accident. We had a small funeral, but only close relatives were invited. Yuki wasn't there. She doesn't even know her mother is dead. She thinks her mother is just on a long holiday. We haven't had the heart to tell her the truth. "Poor Yuki," I murmured. My aunt nodded her head sadly. Poor Yuki. A few days after that, Yuki died. My aunt was trying to change Yuki's behavior. At night, she forced the little girl to sleep in her own bedroom. Even though Yuki screamed and cried, my aunt left her there alone and locked the door. In the morning, she found Yuki lying motionless in bed, and the poor little girl was dead. Nobody could understand what had happened. The coroner could not determine the cause of death. There wasn't a mark on her body. She was perfectly healthy. She had just mysteriously died during the night. There was no explanation. After the funeral, I went back to my aunt's house. Everyone was very sad. She returned the digital camera I had given to Yuki. I took it home with me. It was something to remember her by. The memory card was full of random photos that Yuki had taken. I browsed through them, wiping a tear away from my eye. There were pictures of my apartment, pictures of my aunt's house, flowers, dogs, toys, candy, silly pictures that a child would take. Then, I came to the last picture, and it made my blood run cold. My hands were trembling. I wanted to scream, but nothing would come out. The timestamp on the photo showed that it had been taken the night Yuki died. Here is the last picture that poor little girl ever took with my digital camera.
Futa Kuchiona, or the Two-Mouthed Woman, is a Japanese urban legend about a woman who was cursed with having two mouths, one normal mouth at the front, and another, hidden, monstrous mouth in the back of her head. Futa Kuchiona is a monstrous woman with a tiny mouth. However, on the back of her head, hidden beneath her hair, she has a huge second mouth. The woman's skull splits apart, revealing lips, teeth, and a tongue. Although she appears to never eat, the mouth in the back of her head is ravenous and consumes huge quantities of food. They say that the big mouth has a mind of its own and speaks to the woman, mumbling spiteful and threatening things to her. The mouth will harass the woman and threaten her, demanding food. It will screech obsessively and cause the woman tremendous pain until it is fed. The monstrous mouth can also control the woman's hair, making it snake out like tentacles, grabbing food and shoveling it down its throat. There is some disagreement in Japan as to Futa Kuchiona's origins and how she got her second mouth. One story from Japanese folklore tells of an old miser who lived by himself in a small village. He never got married because he hated spending money. He thought that if he took a wife, he would have to pay for her food, and he could not bear the idea of parting with his wealth. It so happened that he came across a young woman who did not eat a thing and immediately asked her to marry him because she seemed to never eat and was a hard worker. The old miser was thrilled that he had found the woman of his dreams, and the couple were very happy together. However, he began to wonder why his stores of rice were steadily decreasing. One day, the man pretended to leave for work, but instead stayed behind to spy on his wife. To his horror, he saw his wife's hair part on the back of her head, her skull split wide open, revealing a gaping, deformed mouth. Her hair reached out like tentacles, grasping handfuls of rice and shoveling it into its monstrous mouth. When the woman noticed her husband had discovered her secret, she attacked him and tried to strangle him. He managed to get away and hid in the mountains. Weeks later, when he worked up the courage to return, he found the woman had gone, and all of his stores of rice had been eaten. The old man never married again. In another story, a man's wife died, leaving him with a daughter to care for. The man remarried, but his new wife was a very mean and vindictive person. Together, they had a second child, another daughter. However, they were poor, and there was barely enough food to go around. The new wife decided to keep her own daughter fed while she starved the other girl. The man's daughter eventually died of starvation. Not long afterwards, the man was out in the garden chopping wood for the fire. He accidentally swung his axe incorrectly and embedded it in the back of his wife's head. There was a lot of blood, and he expected the woman to die. She survived, but the open wound never healed. Instead, it formed into a huge, drooling mouth, complete with teeth and a tongue. The woman was in tremendous pain, and the only way to make it stop was to feed the deformed mouth. It demanded more and more food to keep it satisfied. Eventually, the mouth started making sounds and started talking. One day, while the woman was asleep, the hideous mouth spoke to her husband and confessed, "I am cursed because I killed your daughter by starving her to death."
Kun Kun is described as an unidentifiable white squiggle moving back and forth in the distance. Nobody knows exactly what it looks like, because anyone who has seen it has lost their mind. One Japanese man tells an encounter he had as a child with a Kun Kun. When I was young, my parents brought my older brother and I to visit my grandmother and grandfather. We didn't see her very much, because she lived very far out the countryside in Akita. As soon as we arrived at our grandparents' house, my brother and I went out to play. The air was much fresher and cleaner than it was in the city. We walked through the rice fields, enjoying the wide open spaces. The sun was high in the sky, and there was no breeze. The heat was stifling after a while. I started to get tired. Then my brother stopped suddenly. He was staring at something in the distance. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "That thing over there," he replied. The rice fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and the area was completely deserted. I squinted my eyes, but I couldn't make out what it was. Far away, across the fields, there was this white thing, about the size of a person. It was moving and wriggling as if it was fluttering in the breeze. "Maybe it's a scarecrow," I said. "That's not a scarecrow," my brother replied. "Scarecrows don't move like that." "Maybe it's a sheet then," I said. "No, it's not a sheet," he replied. "There are no other houses around here. Besides, there's no wind. But it's still moving and wriggling. The heck is that thing?" I had a strange and uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. My brother ran back to the house, and when he returned, he was carrying a pair of binoculars. "Oh, can I see?" I said excitedly. I made a grab for the binoculars, but he pushed me back. "No, me first," he said with a chuckle. "I'm the oldest. You can have a look when I'm done." As soon as my brother put the binoculars up to his eyes, I noticed his expression suddenly changed. His face grew pale, and he broke out into a cold sweat. He dropped the binoculars to the ground, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "What was it?" I asked nervously. My brother replied slowly, "There it is. There it is. There it is." It was not my brother's voice. Without another word, he turned and started walking back to the house. Something didn't feel right. With trembling hands, I bent down and picked up the binoculars, but I was too scared to look through them. In the distance, the white object was still twisting and turning. Just then, my grandfather came running over. "What are you doing with those binoculars?" he asked. "Nothing," I replied. "Just looking at that white thing over there." "What?" he shouted. "You shouldn't look at that." He snatched the binoculars from my grasp. "Did you see it?" he demanded angrily. "Did you look through the binoculars?" "No," I said in a meek voice. Not yet. My grandfather sighed with relief. Good, he said. That's good. Without knowing why, I was sent back to the house. When I walked into the kitchen, everyone was crying. My brother was rolling around on the ground, laughing like a crazy person. He was on his back and his body was wriggling and twisting, just like that white thing in the distance. I couldn't understand what was going on. It was horrible to see him like that. I burst into tears myself. He wasn't my brother anymore. He had completely lost his mind. The next day, my parents decided to take us home. My grandmother and grandfather stood on their porch, waving sadly to us as the car pulled away. I sat in the back seat with my brother, wiping the tears from my eyes. My brother was still laughing like a mental patient. They had to tie him up to stop him from moving around. His face was twisted into a wide smile. He looked like he was happy, but when I saw his eyes, I realized he was crying. It sent a chill down my spine. His cheeks were wet with tears, but he just kept laughing and laughing. My father pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. He took out the binoculars and furiously smashed him on the street. Then, without saying anything, he got back into the car and kept driving. Another Japanese man tells his experience with the twister kun-kun when he was a young boy. When I was a little boy, I lived in a small town by the seashore in Chiba Prefecture. One evening, my uncle took me for a walk on the beach. As we strolled down the strand, I looked out to the sea and noticed something white in the distance. It was a long thing, swaying back and forth. I wondered what it could be. "What's that thing in the sea?" I asked my uncle. He gazed at it, and I saw his eyes grow wide, and his face turn pale. There was a terrified look in his eyes. He couldn't stop staring at it. "Run for your life!" he shouted frantically. I didn't know what was going on, but I was scared, so I ran back home and told my grandfather. He went pale. "That's a kun-kun," he said. "You're lucky to get away from it. You should never look directly at it." "Where's your uncle?" "He's still at the seashore," I replied, my voice shaking. "I've got to rescue my son," my grandfather said as he took off as fast as he could to the seashore. I followed close behind him, worried and frightened. From a distance, I could see my uncle standing on the beach. It was as if he was frozen on the spot, staring at the white meandering thing far out to sea. My grandfather broke a branch off the tree and approached my uncle, muttering some kind of prayer under his breath. He kept his eyes cast down, careful not to look at the white thing. My grandfather managed to drag my uncle away and brought him home. Although my uncle was saved, he suffered from fits of madness and insanity the rest of his life. Since it happened, he has been in and out of mental homes many times. He was never the same after that.
The Kuchisaka Onna, also known as the Slit-Mouthed Woman, is a scary Japanese urban legend about a disfigured Japanese woman who brandishes large scissors and preys on children. She has an enormous slit mouth which extends from ear to ear in a horrible permanent smile. The Slit-Mouthed Woman walks the streets of Japan wearing a surgical mask and hunting for children. If you cross her path, she will stop you and ask you a question. If you give her the wrong answer, there will be horrible consequences. Picture the scene. You are walking home from school and your path takes you down a deserted city street. Suddenly, you hear a faint noise coming from the shadows. You glance over and see a beautiful woman standing there. She has long black hair and is wearing a beige trench coat. A surgical mask covers the lower half of her face. In Japan, wearing a surgical mask is not uncommon during flu season to prevent spreading germs. She steps out of the shadows and blocks your path. "Am I beautiful?" she asks. Before he can answer, she tears off her mask, revealing a hideously deformed face. Her huge mouth is sliced from ear to ear and gapes open, revealing rows of sharp teeth and a big red, disgusting tongue twisting and twirling inside. Am I beautiful now? She screams. Terrified, you struggle to answer her. If you say no, she pulls out a huge pair of scissors and kills you immediately, chopping off your head. If you say yes, she takes her scissors and slices your mouth from ear to ear, making you look just like her. If you try to run away, she will hunt you down and kill you by slicing you in two. The only way to escape from Kuchisaka Anna is to give a non-committed answer. If you say you look average or you look normal, she will be confused, giving you just enough time to run away. There are many rumors about how Kuchisaka Anna got her horrible disfigured mouth. Some say that her slit mouth is a result of plastic surgery that went horribly wrong. Others say that she was injured in a terrible car crash. Some even believe that she is an escaped mental patient who was so demented that she cut her own mouth apart. According to one legend, years ago in Japan, there lived a very beautiful woman who was extremely vain and self-absorbed. Her husband was a very jealous and brutal man, and he became convinced that she was cheating on him. In a fit of rage, he took a sword and slit her mouth from ear to ear, screaming, "Who will think you're beautiful now?" She became a vengeful spirit and began walking the streets of Japan wearing a surgical mask to hide her terrible scars. The slit-mouthed woman's reign of terror began in the spring and summer of 1979 when rumors began to spread throughout Japan about sightings of the Kuchisaka Anna hunting down children. The story spread like wildfire and actually created scares in many towns. Police increased their patrols and schools sent teachers to walk students home in groups. In 2004, South Korea was plagued by reports of a red-masked woman who was chasing children. In 2007, a coroner found some old records from the late 70s about a woman who was chasing little children but was hit by a car and died shortly after. Her mouth was ripped from ear to ear. The US had its own version of Kuchisaka Anna. There are rumors about a clown who appeared in public bathrooms and accosted children, asking, "Do you want death or a happy smile?" If they chose happy smile, he took out a knife and slit their mouth from ear to ear.
I grew up during the 80s in this little town called Durant, which is about 6 miles east of Brandon, Florida. Until I was 15 years old, my best friends in the world were these two kids named Bobby and Joey, and we were basically inseparable. Not only did we all go to the same elementary and middle schools, but we spent all of our free time together too. Bobby and Joey were like polar opposites. Like it was weird that we were even friends to begin with. Bobby was more outgoing while Joey was more reserved. Bobby would eat just about anything while Joey was easily the fussiest eater I've ever known. It extended to almost everything, including how scary they found horror movies. And boy, did we love horror movies. We tried just about every trick in the book to sneak into theaters to watch The Thing or Nightmare on Elm Street. Sometimes we succeeded and sometimes not. But when we did get in, the result was always the same. Joey would be on the verge of a panic attack for the entire showing, while Bobby would be complaining how it all looked fake or how it wasn't scary enough for him. Nothing seemed to be able to freak him out, not even the transformation scene in American Werewolf in London. He was impressed, sure, but not in the least bit grossed out or whatever. And I suppose that's why he thought the haunted house at a traveling fair wouldn't scare him either. It was late August of 1985 when the traveling fair came to town, and seeing as nothing good was showing down at the local movie theater, we figured we'd stop by to see what it was all about. It was all the usual stuff: cotton candy, fairground rides, BB shooting galleries, but the thing that really caught our attention was the haunted house. For a janky traveling fair, it actually looked pretty cool, and was certainly more of an attractive prospect than the carousel. So after finishing our hot dogs, we headed over to the ticket booth to ask them how much. I remember the guy in the booth had all this skeletal face paint on, and when we asked him for 3 tickets, he put on this spooky voice like, "Are you sure you boys have the constitution for such a terrifying trial?" We were just like, "Yeah, dude, just give us the tickets already." Then we walk up towards the entrance to go inside. So the way this thing was laid out was a giant box room that had been divided up into corridors. You made your way through various corridors, some which narrowed so you had to squeeze through them, and every so often, a mechanical doodad would jump out to scare you, or an actual person would. I'll admit that the actual people, one of which had a pretty cool wolfman mask, were actually pretty creepy, especially the woman who pretended to be a statue, right up until we tried to pass her, then just touched my shoulder and it almost gave me a heart attack in the process. Got to applaud that level of commitment and subtlety, right? Anyway, me and Joey thought it was pretty cool, even though he was so scared he was ready to puke, but Bobby thought the whole thing was dumb, so much so that he walked right up to the ticket vendor and demanded his money back. Of course, the guy just points to a little sign that says no refunds, but does so in such a dismissive way that Bobby just about exploded. He started ranting about how it was the worst haunted house he'd ever been to, and that no one in their right mind should ever pay for anything so terrible. The guy takes this for a minute or two, then lowers his voice and says something that seems to calm Bobby down. Then when he walks back to us, we find out that this is what the guy said. "If you really want to see something scary in there, come back later at around 10 p.m. You're still not satisfied, we'll give you your money back." It seemed sketchy, to say the least, but Bobby assured us that the guy was serious, and somehow we'd gotten it into our heads that we'd be getting to see the adult haunted house. Bearing in mind we were kids who had trouble getting into R-rated movies, so I don't think I could possibly understate how excited we were. We heard that traveling carnivals were known to get a little risque after dark, so the prospect of getting to see that sort of thing in action, it felt like a real adventure. Me and Joey had a curfew of 9 p.m., but we got around it by saying we were staying over at Bobby's. Only Bobby's mom worked as a night nurse on weekends, so there'd be no one around to disprove that. It was a foolproof plan. At least, it seemed that way for a while. But as a matter of fact, our little visit to the carnival would end our friendship and change our lives forever. The first sign that something was wrong was when we showed up and the whole place seemed to be closed down. There were lights on here and there, a few workers wandering around carrying heavy-looking tools, but other than that, the place was deserted. At first I figured the guy had just played a trick on us, as in, come back later, but I'll be long gone. But Bobby was determined to get his money back, and we followed him through the carnival grounds until we came across the haunted house. True to his word, there was the ticket seller, sitting on the steel stairs that led up to the entrance. He made some comment about being surprised we'd showed up, how he'd figured we were too chicken to come back for the midnight show, as he called it. We just laughed. Midnight show? It wasn't a minute past 10 p.m., and there he was trying to be all spooky again. But then, Bobby asked him what was so scary about the midnight show and if he'd really be given a refund if it didn't frighten him. Again, the guy promises if it doesn't spook him, he gets his money back. But what he said next really set me on edge and immediately had me thinking twice about my decision to return. He started off by saying how the carnival didn't like leaving paying visitors unhappy, and that if we really wanted to be scared, he could show us something that'd leave us very frightened indeed. He said it was something to keep in reserve for those dissatisfied with the haunted house, something that very few have come to witness without losing their sanity altogether. He said only a small, dedicated crew handles the midnight show, because the sheer psychological strain of the performance can be extremely harmful to their mental health. I remember Bobby piping up like, "I'm not dumb, dude. I see what you're doing. You're just gonna beat the snot out of us when we get in here, as payback for talking smack." The guy laughed, then swore on his mother's grave that each of us would walk in of our own volition and walk out totally unharmed. As for our sanity, he couldn't guarantee it'd still be in one piece by the end. Obviously, Joey was out from the word go. He's like, "Nope, screw this, I'm not going in." Bobby, on the other hand, was typical Bobby. I don't think wild horses could have dragged him away from that carnival. But me? There was something about the way the ticket vendor was talking. He wasn't trying to sound scary or be scary. He actually sounded kind of scared himself, almost like he didn't want us to go in. And either he was an Oscar-level acting talent or there really was something to what he was saying. I'll never forget the way Bobby looked at me when I said, yeah, I'm good actually. I think I'll stay here with Joey. It was like disgust mixed with ridicule. I know for a fact he thought I was being a big baby for having let the carny dude psych me out, but I made my mind up and I wasn't going to budge. In the end, Bobby went in on his own while me and Joey waited for him outside. I could tell he felt a little nervous walking in, but I was nervous too. I was nervous for him. Because as much as we'd be reassured that nothing was going to happen to him, a little piece of me still thought Bobby was going to get his bell rung as soon as he walked in. Me and Joey are outside for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, waiting for Bobby while wondering what could be going on in that haunted house. There wasn't any noise or anything, not like during the daytime when you could hear all those dumb evil laughter sounds and wolves howling and whatnot. And our walkthrough in the daytime had taken like 5 minutes tops. So when 20, then 25, then 30 minutes went by, we started to get pretty freaking worried for Bobby. Only right when we're about to go banging on the haunted house's door, Bobby reappears. No limps, no swelling, no bleeding. He looked okay, but he wasn't, and I'm not sure Bobby was ever really okay again. I remember walking back to his mom's place like it was yesterday and the exasperation I felt when we asked Bobby what happened, and all he said was nothing. We were flabbergasted. It certainly didn't seem like nothing had happened because Bobby was definitely shaken up by something. At first he was pale, visibly shaking, and he had this kind of vacant expression on his face. It's hard to explain. He seemed mostly just shocked by whatever it was he'd seen, but he was definitely disturbed too. We kept at it, begging him to tell us what he'd seen, but he just wouldn't say. All he'd give us was, "Nothing. Stop asking about it." We asked him if it was scary, and he said yes, but he denied any kind of violence had occurred. The guy promised he wouldn't be touched, and he'd apparently been true to his word on that too. But that did mean they hadn't done something to Bobby, and despite all his denials, I know that was the case. The last thing he said about it, before he threatened to kick us out of his mom's house if we asked again, was a couple of hours later when Joey finally broke and asked him, "Dude, I'm begging you, at least give us a clue. What happened in there?" "Something that doesn't make sense," Bobby replied. He never talked about it ever again. I know that seems unbelievable, but time moves pretty fast at that age. We were due to start our junior year of high school. I started dating that first semester. Joey broke his arm on Bobby's skateboard that winter, and there was other stuff to think about. I'm not saying we just forgot about it and it came up in conversation once or twice in the months that followed, but every time we brought it up, Bobby would just give us this look. And the one time we persisted, he just walked back home without a word and didn't return our calls for a week. I'd like to say that dropping the subject for good repaired our friendship, but it didn't. Like I might have said earlier, what happened that night was the beginning of the end of our little friendship triangle, and we slowly began to drift apart. The end of the end, if that makes any sense, was when Bobby and his mom moved out to New Hampshire for her job. We all promised we'd keep in touch, but we never did, and I think me and Joey just bummed each other out after that, always wondering what happened to Bobby, always hoping he'd call someday, but he didn't call, and we didn't ever get the number for his new place. I still think about Bobby an awful lot, and I still think about him saying something that didn't make any sense. I've racked my dumb brain for literally decades, but I just can't work out what he meant by that. My wife thinks he was lying and that those carnival workers really did lay hands on him or something. Just because he didn't have any cuts or bruises doesn't mean they didn't slap him around or threaten him a little, and besides, you can do a lot worse things to someone without leaving a black eye or a bruised lip. I sometimes wonder if that really is true. That what happened to him was so traumatic that he just couldn't deal with it. But Bobby was brave, man. I think he was the bravest and most defiant person I've ever known. If the tough thing needed doing, Bobby did it. And I think that if that thing just so happened to be opening up about being hurt or something, Bobby would have done it. Maybe later rather than sooner, but he would have. And I think I'll just end this here. Whenever I talk about Bobby, every third word of my mouth is maybe, and I'm so sick of maybes that I can barely even describe it. I just hope his story isn't over yet, that he's out there, somewhere, living a happy, fruitful life. I try to look up him on Facebook every so often just to see if he made an account or something, but I've had no luck as of yet. But maybe next week, or maybe next year, I'll finally find out what happened to Bobby, and get to say hello to an old friend in the process. Maybe. Just maybe. Okay, so this isn't strictly my story, because the whole thing involves my grandpa and my great aunt, his sister. But since they're no longer with us anymore, it's one of the most horrifying true stories I've ever heard, and I figured I'm within my rights to tell it. My grandpa grew up during the Great Depression in a really poor town out in Oklahoma. I mean, the way my mom tells it, they really didn't have a pot to pee in. They used to eat stuff like dandelion salad, literally just eating boiled eggs with wild dandelions. They were that broke. Even worse for my grandpa and great aunt, who were like 12 and 8 years old respectively at this time, there's absolutely nothing to keep them entertained. They made a good go of it, turning pieces of junk into toys. Like, ever see that old-timey thing of a kid whipping a bike tire along with a stick? Yeah, that kind of thing. Their childhoods were just not like ours. They were accustomed to extreme boredom, grinding poverty, and backbreaking labor, so you can guess how excited they got when they heard the carnival was coming to town. There'd be games, rides, candy, sideshows, absolutely everything a kid that age could ever want. The only thing was, their family didn't have the money for them all to go, just enough for 2 entry tickets, with a little left over for cotton candy. So, being the good folks they were, my great-grandparents decided they'd give the kids the money while they stayed home. It must have been like all their Christmases had come at once. The only condition was that my 12-year-old grandpa was not to let my 8-year-old great-aunt out of his sight. Then, on the evening in question, Grandpa and great-aunt are given like 50 cents between them and told to be back by sundown. Then they run off down to the pasture where the carnival's been given permission to set up. The way my dad tells it, for the first hour or so, Grandpa and great-aunt had the time of their lives. I think tickets were like 5 cents or something, then cotton candy was 2 cents apiece. Basically, their parents had underestimated how expensive stuff would be, so they were able to partake in everything the carnival had to offer, twice. Maybe that's what lulled them into a false sense of security, because it certainly accounts for them staying long after the sun started to set. Only, when my grandpa realized how late it was, and he started looking around for my great-aunt, she was nowhere to be seen. I once remember asking my dad why they just thought it was okay to let their kids go running around on their own like that, if it's just like an old-timey thing or because they were so poor. Dad said it was more like because all the people going to the carnival were their neighbors. They didn't figure there was any risk. But then there's my grandpa, totally unable to find his sister, and he's starting to get worried. He started asking all the people he recognized from our town if they'd seen his sister, but they all said no. Right up until one of our neighbors said they saw my great-aunt walking hand in hand with a grown-up. I think they figured it was my great-grandpa or something, but when my grandpa explains that his dad isn't even there, this guy launches into action to try and help find my great-aunt. So, Grandpa and this random neighbor guy apparently ran away from the actual carnival and towards where the workers had set up their trailers and whatnot. That's when they heard a girl crying from inside of them. The neighbor tries to open the door up, but it won't budge, so he starts banging on it. Some evil son of a gun opens the door and tries to explain it away by saying my great aunt got lost or something. But she's just inconsolable, crying in a way that Grandpa had never seen before, scared but sad at the same time. This neighbor then rushes my grandpa and great aunt home and tells their parents all about what had happened. My grandpa knows something bad happened to his sister, but he just doesn't know what because she sure won't talk about it. Obviously, my great-grandpa was absolutely furious, so he grabs a shotgun, rounds up a few buddies, and they went down to the carnival to basically do God knows what to this guy. Again, this is all from my dad, but according to him, this huge fight starts at the carnival. People on all sides almost get shot. Then they all freeze after the carnival chief fires a gun into the air. He then agrees to parley with my great-grandpa. Then after talking for like 10 minutes in some weird-looking carny trailer, my great-grandpa walks away from the carnival empty-handed. Everyone thought he was crazy. Some monster had just put his hands on his only daughter, and after a short powwow with the man in charge, he was happy to just walk away. His buddies confront him on it, obviously wanting to know what the deal was, but my great-grandpa apparently tells them to put a sock in it, because it's all been ironed out. That night, my great-grandpa apparently puts on his boots, then headed down to the carnival one more time before it left town. He meets up with the carny chief, who asks if my great-grandpa still wants satisfaction, which he obviously did. At that, the carny chief beckons to two workers, who carry out like a basket or something, before laying it in front of my great-grandpa. When they invited him to open the lid, he complied, and when the smell hit him, I doubt he had it in him not to puke. Because according to my dad, the carnies had stacked the offending worker's severed head on a pile of his own guts, and his own junk had been stuffed into his mouth. The carny chief then told him, while pointing at his junk, "First we cut off this, then we cut out those," then points to the guy's guts. Only when he stopped moving did we cut off that, then points to his head. Apparently after that, the carny chief once again asked my great-grandpa, "Are you satisfied?" He just nodded, turned, and then walked away. The carnival was gone the next day. I think he told my great-aunt what happened to that guy too, because she never seemed too torn up about it. I know something really bad must have happened if they killed the guy, but she actually went back to the carnival the next time it came around. And to borrow a phrase from my son, I guess they were built different back then, and just dealt with trauma differently or whatever. Or maybe it's much easier to get over that sort of thing when you know the guy who did it suffered on Earth before he died. I suppose that's what freaks me out so much about my grandpa's story, that it almost sounds like it came from a different country or something. All that poverty and vigilante justice. I just don't recognize that same kind of thing in America today, not in such an extreme way anyways. And that sure has me counting my blessings, let me tell you. Organized crime is possibly the greatest plague that human society has ever faced. It's a phenomenon that's developed organically throughout almost every culture and nation that's ever existed. From the Thuggee cults of 13th century India to the Japanese Yakuza and the Russian Vors, it seems that certain sections of humanity are simply inclined towards criminality. And just like their law-abiding counterparts, they've found that coalition is often a superior choice to outright conflict. As we all know, the United States also has its fair share of organized crime, most often recognized in the forms of New York's Five Families, Murder, Inc., or perhaps the Crips and Bloods. But is it possible for smaller, less renowned, but more efficient forms of mafia to exist in 21st century America? And what if they took on some very unfamiliar, even comical new forms? Essentially what I'm asking is there any such thing as the carnival mafia? I can hear some of you laughing already, picturing guys in clown outfits doing the whole Joe Pesci bit of, "Funny how? How am I funny? Do I amuse you?" But I'm serious, deadly serious. So without further ado, let me tell you the story of Alfred and Pauline Carpenter. Alfred and Pauline loved the carnival. Al, or Sonny as people sometimes called him, hailed from Oak Lawn in California, while Pauline was born in Walnut, Kansas. The couple were married on May 17th of 1986 in El Dorado, Kansas, and spent the next 32 years of their lives raising several loving children along the way. By all accounts, Pauline and Al were happiest when in each other's company, and many a photograph of the couple showed just how in love they really were. After retiring from aeronautical giant Boeing, where they both were employed, Al and Pauline made their living selling homemade jewelry at county fairs, and although it didn't exactly make them a mint, the nomadic lifestyle suited the septuagenarian couple immensely. They were able to meet interesting new people while traveling the country they loved, and best of all, they got to do it together. This is how they ended up in Great Bend, Kansas, on July 13th of 2018 during the Barton County Fair. It was a typically wholesome summer affair, featuring a tractor pull, Ferris wheel, a rabbit show, and a root beer float social. There were prizes for the best homegrown rhubarb stalks, green beans, and summer squash, along with a much-coveted trophy for the county's largest potato. Just like they'd done many times before, Al and Pauline Carpenter set up their stall, arranged their goods in charming displays, and began friendly bartering sessions with the local townsfolk. The vast majority of their interactions were positive, but it's believed that at some point during the day, some kind of confrontation occurred between the Carpenters and their fellow carnival workers. At first glance, the confrontation doesn't seem to be too significant, as Al and Pauline continue to operate their stall until the end of the working day, and simply retire to their RV for the evening. But as it turned out, the encounter would have deadly implications for them. 4 days later, on July 17th, the Van Buren Police Department received a rather distressing call from a woman who claimed her sister, Christine Tenney, was being held hostage. She went on to tell the dispatcher that 2 criminals had murdered a couple, stolen their RV, and were now holding her sister as a hostage at a residence known as the Vista Hill Apartments. Heavily armed police officers rushed to the apartment complex and were greeted by the sights of a large camper van with bullet holes in it. So far, the information was good, but just as they were in the process of locking the apartment complex down, who should they find, alive and well, but Christine Tenney. Christine was baffled by the reports of her kidnapping, claiming she was in no danger whatsoever. But when the parked RV was searched, police found trash bags full of bloody paper towels, blood-soaked clothing, and 2 spent 9mm bullet casings. It was quite obvious that some kind of violent struggle, perhaps even a murder, had taken place in the RV, and when the cops ran the vehicle's plates to discover who the owner was, Al Carpenter's name came back. Naturally, the police were very interested in talking to the person that had made the report in the first place. Given they had the caller's sister, it was quite easy to track them down, and the person in question turned out to be a 52-year-old Florida woman named Kimberly Younger. Not only did Kimberly have a weak explanation as to why she thought her sister was in danger, chalking it up to a simple miscommunication, but she claimed that Al and Pauline Carpenter were just fine, and that she'd given them a ride to a casino in the hours before their RV was stolen. It's then the cops noticed that Kimberly didn't seem to own a car, and when pressed as to what vehicle she'd used to give the Carpenters a ride, she claimed to have hired a car from a rental place that she couldn't remember the name of. Obviously, investigating officers found this to be highly suspicious, and they ordered the arrest of several carnival workers. When 2 of these carnival workers turned out to be none other than Christine Tenney and an ex-boyfriend of Kimberly Younger's named Michael Fowler, police began to realize they were onto something. Then, when Michael Fowler seemed to display an alarming amount of guilt during an interview, police applied the right amount of pressure, and he broke. Through tears of anguish and remorse, Fowler admitted to murdering the Carpenters, and is reported to have said, "She had me suckered the whole time. I just threw my whole life away. It was supposed to be my blood in." When police asked what he meant by blood in, they were well aware of the gangland connotations, but what kind of organization could this lowly carnival worker have been trying to enter? After agreeing to cooperate with the authorities to avoid the death penalty, Fowler showed them the shallow graves in Arkansas where the Carpenters were buried, then went about telling them everything he knew. He claimed to have been in communication with a man named Frank Zaitchik, owner and operator of a Michigan-based traveling carnival company called Wade Shows, Inc. But according to Michael Fowler, Frank had another, considerably more sinister occupation: leader of the Carnival Mafia. At some point during questioning, Fowler got out his phone and showed police a series of Facebook messages purported to be between him and Frank Zaitchik. In one message at around 2:30 a.m. on July 14th, Fowler had written, "It's done. They're dead." "Good job, now get out," Frank Zaitchik replied. "I'm trying to calm down right now," Fowler wrote back. "Deep breaths," read Zaitchik's response. "The first is always the hardest. Jen sent me pictures of the man. I sent on to the heads of council. War is over." Police tried tracking Zaitchik down and were successful in finding a Michigan carnival operator by the same name. But Zaitchik denied having any knowledge of the killings and categorically denied that there was any such thing as the Carnival Mafia. Zaitchik went on to say that he didn't know the alleged suspects or the victims. As far as he could recall, they had never been employed by Wade Shows, Inc. He was quick to add that he had no idea why they would use his name. "It's kind of bone-chilling," he said. "I'd like to talk to the cops about it, but no one's reached out. I'm a solid citizen. I have nothing to hide. And Wade Shows has a wonderful reputation." Zaitchik went on to deny ownership of the Facebook account that was in communication with the murderer, despite the fact that it included several seemingly intimate photographs of him. All the cops had to do was establish a concrete link between Zaitchik and the killer, and they had a solid murder case. But then, just a few days later, Kimberly Younger contacted police with a jaw-dropping confession. She claimed to have set up a false Facebook account and had been posing as Frank Zaitchik in order to trick her ex-boyfriend into murdering the Carpenters. She seemed desperate to absolve Zaitchik of all culpability and assured police that she and she alone was responsible for ordering the Carpenters' death. It's also possible that it was she who revealed the involvement of 37-year-old Texas man named Rusty Frazier. Frazier is said to have facilitated the murders in some manner, possibly by either supplying the weapon or aiding in the disposal of the bodies. It's not clear if Rusty Frazier was working the Barton County Fair around the time that the Carpenters were killed, but his ability to quickly transport the remains out of the state suggests that there may be an even wider network of people who had a hand in the murders. Most of those arrested vehemently denied the existence of any kind of carnival mafia and insisted they acted alone. Michael Fowler later retracted his statements about it being a blood-in style initiation and insisted he simply had been tricked as part of a petty personal rivalry. Kimberly Younger had also spoken of a kind of carny mafia and gave the police some rather detailed stories of how they laundered money, collected protection money, and murdered anyone who refused to cooperate. Yet she too retracted her statements after the police investigated Frank Zaitchik's role in the murders, almost as if though they'd been warned to shut their mouths or face the consequences. Officially, law enforcement in both Kansas and Arkansas have stated that there is no carnival mafia, maintaining the concept as nothing more than the frantic fabrication of two murder suspects. But at the same time, there has never been any conclusive explanation as to why exactly the Carpenters were murdered. It's often explained away as a disagreement or confrontation that suddenly turned violent, but even so, the root cause of the conflict had never been accounted for. Could it be that the argument arose over the Carpenters' refusal to pay protection money, and were the Carpenters killed so that the Carnival Mafia could make an example out of them? If the official statement of the police is to be believed, then no, it's all just a crazy coincidence. Frank Zaitchik's name was picked because he's the wealthy owner of several successful fairgrounds. But until the root cause of the confrontation is confirmed, until we have an actual concrete motive for the Carpenters' murders, there's still room to wonder. Is there really such a thing as the Carnival Mafia? Mark Anthony Tildesley was born on August 31st of 1976 to John and Lavinia Tildesley. The Tildesleys lived in the small English town of Wokingham in Berkshire, and in 1984, 7-year-old Mark was a Year 3 pupil at the nearby Palmer Church of England Junior School. On May 25th, Mark's school was on break for its summer half-term holiday, and given as a lot of young children had nothing to occupy themselves with, the Frank Ayers Fun Fair had come to town during that holiday week. To say Mark was eager to visit the fun fair would be an understatement of the century. He saved up his 30p weekly pocket money for an entire month, and added to his savings by doing odd jobs under the supervision of his parents. Mark became somewhat famous around the town for being the industrious little redhead with a rather sizable collection of 10p pieces. A local shopkeeper, Margaret Hickman, was fond of little Mark and has many happy memories of him counting out the right number of coins to pay for his candy. So on the afternoon of June 1st, 1984, when Mark handed over a 50p piece to pay for his candies, Margaret found it very odd indeed. She watched Mark collect up his goods before returning to an adult outside, but it wasn't Mark's father or mother. In fact, Margaret didn't recognize the man at all. This was also odd because pretty much everyone in town knew each other and could instantly recognize an outsider. But since she also overheard the man tell Mark that he was going to the fair later that day and that he would pay for him to go on the dodgems that evening, she figured he was simply an older relative. Later that day, just after 5:30, Mark rode his gold Raleigh Tomahawk bicycle the half-mile to the carnival ground. He promised his parents that he'd be back home no later than 7:30 p.m., with his mother recalling him saying, "Don't worry, Mom, I won't be late." While en route to the carnival, he apparently met up with 2 school friends, but they wanted to go back home to change before heading down to the fairgrounds. So Mark made the decision to ride down alone, hoping to scout out the best rides before friends showed up. A few hours later, back at the Tildesleys' house, it was fast approaching 7:30 and there was no sign of young Mark. 7:30 came and went, but by the time 7:45 rolled around, Mark's parents were beginning to get worried, and by 8 p.m. sharp, they left their home to look for him down at the fairgrounds. On their arrival, the first thing they noticed was his gold Raleigh Tomahawk, chained up to a metal fence near the fair's entrance. This seemed to confirm that Mark was still present, but after searching all over the carnival, John and Lavinia couldn't find hide nor hair of their son. At around 10 p.m., a terrified Lavinia contacted the Wokingham Constabulary to report Mark missing, and subsequently enlisted the help of some relatives in continuing the search, but again, not a single trace of little Mark was to be found. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue operations in British history. A ragtag team of police officers, civilian volunteers, and soldiers, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, made up a force that numbered in the hundreds. Then, along with canine and helicopter support, the team scoured every inch of Wokingham town center, as well as the surrounding farmland. Several horrifying false alarms were recorded, the first coming when a train driver claimed to have seen a fox carrying a child's arm in its mouth. Incredibly, this fox was tracked down, but the severed limb turned out to be that of a fowl's, much to the relief of all involved. Then came the call from the nearby village of Crawthorne, where a resident reported a distinct odor of rotting flesh coming from a wooded area behind his backyard. But thankfully the smell was actually caused by a dead sheep, and the hope for Mark's safe return was kept alight. A national appeal for information yielded hundreds of tips from members of the public, and although several reports starkly contradicted one another, one particular report was chillingly possible. A man contacted police to say he caught a glimpse of a boy fitting Mark's description being dragged against his will away from the fairground site between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. that evening. The man added that he assumed the person was a relative, and only realized that might not have been the case when he heard the news of Mark's disappearance. When asked what this man looked like, the caller didn't know, and could only add that the man had terrible posture and appeared to be ever so slightly hunchbacked. In the course of their investigation, local police went about collecting the names of all carnival workers present that evening. After working their way down the list, interviewing and eliminating several of the workers, police reached the name Sidney Cook. They discovered he was a 57-year-old Londoner, and once they learned of his address via the electrical roll, police officers visited Cook at his home, only to discover that Sidney was ever so slightly hunchbacked. When the police asked Cook whether he was in Wokingham on the night Mark disappeared, he not only said no, but he insisted he had an alibi too. He claimed there were people who could vouch that he was working at a fair opposite West Hendon police station in London, and the fair's manager confirmed that Cook was indeed their employee. This forced the police to officially eliminate Cook from their investigation, but he was always viewed with deep suspicion by the investigating detectives, which is why it was shocking but not surprising when Cook's name reappeared in the course of a child murder investigation a few years later. But when it did reappear, it would be in one of the most disturbing ways imaginable. After the arrest of a man named Leslie Catweasel Bailey in 1999, police obtained a letter that chilled the blood of all those who read it. The letter consisted of directions to a shallow grave, one dug into some woodland out in Berkshire. The letter referenced being the final resting place of a boy that had been found at a fair, and it was addressed to none other than Sidney Cook. When confronted with the letter, Sidney confessed to abducting Mark Tildesley. But what he and a select group of friends did next is frankly too terrible to talk about in detail. Let's just say Mark's final moments involved forced ingestion of narcotics, then terrifying levels of mental and physical abuse, and the men who committed these crimes called themselves the Dirty Dozen. This cabal of disgusting sadistic abusers consisted of Sidney Cook, his arrested associate Leslie Bailey, a man named Lenny Smith, and an individual known only as Odd Bod. Leslie Bailey was the only member of the gang who was honest enough to admit what they'd done, and his testimony secured the convictions of Sidney Cook. But that didn't mean he was shown any mercy when he was strangled by another inmate after his conviction and imprisonment. When news of his murder reached John and Lavinia Tildesley, John said he would like to shake the murderer's hand, whilst Lavinia is said to have opened a bottle of wine to celebrate the occasion. Lenny Smith managed to escape all charges by casting as much doubt on Bailey's story as possible, but he didn't escape justice entirely. In 2006, Lenny would die of acquired immune deficiency syndrome in Nottingham prison. Again, the Tildesleys celebrated the news of his long drawn-out and painful death. The fourth man, known only as Odd Bod, was confirmed to be a blood relative of Leslie Bailey. The reason he's only referred to as this bizarre nickname, and in official court documentation at that, is because Odd Bod is so heavily mentally disabled that he's said to have the mind of an 8-year-old. As a result, Odd Bod could not be named, charged, or put on trial or sentenced in connection with Mark's murder. As of 2021, 94-year-old Sidney Cook is the only surviving member of the so-called Dirty Dozen. It's believed that although someone else disposed of Mark's body, Sidney knows where the boy is buried but refuses to tell the police or the boy's family the exact location of their son's final resting place. This is thought to be a depraved method of control, his final method of taking Mark away from his grieving parents. Because if only Sidney knows where their son is buried, then via the sick lens through which he views the world, he still owns him. He took a piece of their boy, and they can never get it back. I think we can all agree that men like Sidney Cook are proof that monsters really do exist. On September 17th of 1992, 14-year-old Misty Donna Copsey accompanied her friend Trina to the Rural State Fair in Puyallup, Washington. Misty was due to return home to Spanaway on the 8:40 p.m. bus, but shortly after, called her mother to inform her that she'd missed its departure, but would be getting a ride back with a friend of hers named Reuben Schmidt. Yet despite being longtime friends, Misty's mother had taken an inexplicable dislike to the young man and forbid her daughter from getting a ride home with him, even if it meant she had to walk the full 8 miles between Puyallup and her neighborhood. A witness is said to have spotted her in downtown Puyallup, walking along in the direction of the Highway 512 on-ramp. This is the last time anyone would see Misty alive. It took a week before a missing persons report was filed, and investigating officers found that Misty's home life was far from pleasant. Her mother struggled with chronic alcoholism. She had a criminal record for welfare fraud, and she often left her daughter unsupervised for extended periods of time. It took her a full 7 days to even notice her daughter was gone, and it goes without saying that Misty's case was just as likely to one of a runaway child than any kind of abduction. That being said, the case was thrown into doubt almost as quickly as it opened, as 2 of Misty's classmates claimed to have seen and spoken to her in the week prior. The case wasn't entirely closed, but it gave the police the impression that the missing persons report was nothing more than a tragic mistake. It took weeks before the investigation was taken seriously, and it took a whopping 5 months for law enforcement to interview the 2 people that had last seen her. One of these people was a friend of Misty's named Trina Brevard, who had accompanied Misty to the Puyallup Fair. Trina said that on the night in question, Misty had gotten the bus, while it was her that was forced to walk home. This confused the investigating officers somewhat, and it was only when they continued to poke and prod at Trina's story that they realized she might be lying. Their suspicion was vindicated when they discovered that Trina hadn't walked home at all, and that she'd gotten a ride from her 23-year-old boyfriend, Michael J. Reiner. Due to the disgustingly illegal nature of their relationship, 14-year-old Trina had kept her much older boyfriend a secret from her friends and family. But that's not the only thing the investigation uncovered. Despite having no adult criminal history, Michael had been arrested as a juvenile on charges of abduction and assault, and given the nature of Misty's disappearance, his past made him a prime suspect. When the truth came out, Trina stated that Michael had initially offered Misty a ride, but she refused on account of an intense dislike for him and opted to walk home instead. This led police to theorize that after dropping Trina off back home, Michael had driven back towards the state fair, knowing Misty would be alone and vulnerable. But after he was brought in for questioning, Michael not only passed a polygraph test, but seemed genuinely horrified about her disappearance, offering his full cooperation in any future investigations. Although he was a very suspicious character, the police eventually eliminated Michael as a suspect and turned to other theories to explain Misty's disappearance. Then came the interviews with Misty's forbidden friend, Reuben Schmidt, which were suspicious to say the least. Reuben corroborated everything Trina had said, but for some reason added that he was suffering from chronic blackouts and couldn't remember anything from the night of Misty's disappearance. He claimed that after blacking out during the evening, he had woken up back at his grandma's place in the foothills of Mount Rainier. When asked by police if it was possible that he could have hurt Misty during one of his blackouts, Reuben told them, "I don't know." Police then tried to gain a little background knowledge on Reuben, and they turned to Misty's mother, who may well have had a good reason to dislike the boy. She claimed Reuben was obsessed with Misty, that his infatuation had grown over the years to the point of being unhealthy, and as of late, Reuben had been increasingly aggressive with her, calling her at all hours of the day with pleas to join him on dates. When subject to a polygraph, Reuben's results came out inconclusive, and investigators strongly suspected that he was trying to deceive them in some way. It is understood that Reuben was the case's #1 suspect for a while, right up until late 1992 when suspicion was cast on a third suspect. A local misfit by the name of Corey Bober was said to have become obsessed with Gary Ridgway, better known as Washington's own Green River Killer. There were also 2 unsolved murders of teen girls from the local area, and Bober was said to be obsessed with linking them to Ridgway and the wider Green River killings. Local law enforcement already had an intense dislike of Bober, who had a reputation as being paranoid, unstable, and obnoxious, and he came to their attention in Misty's case because he had reached out to her mother on multiple occasions, urging her to pressure the local police into linking her daughter's disappearance to the murders of the 2 local girls, Kimberly DeLonge and Anna Chebanoy. Both DeLonge and Chebanoy had vanished from the same Puyallup shopping center in 1988 and 1990, respectively, with their bodies found hidden in dense brush off Highway 410 in 1991, less than 100 feet from one another. Bober was also intimately involved in the search for Misty and helped her mother search the same area where DeLonge and Chebenoy's bodies were found. It's believed that he was present the day that Misty's jeans, underwear, and one of her socks were discovered near Highway 410 and Waco Road near Mud Mountain Dam. The items had been rolled neatly and placed in a muddy ditch. Yet despite such a significant discovery, the investigation continued to flounder. The following year, Reuben Schmidt once again seemed to implicate himself when he seemed to hint that he knew where Misty's body was. He apparently told a fellow restaurant employee that investigators were off and that she was buried 6 miles from where her clothing had been found earlier that year. On top of that, Schmidt's grandmother's farm was located around 6 miles from the burial site on Highway 410. Yet for some reason, police simply couldn't collate enough evidence to charge him, and by the end of 1993, the case had essentially gone cold. But when we consider some of the other facts at hand, it seems only a gross mishandling of the investigation can explain why he wasn't arrested. When confronted about making comments suggesting he knew where Misty was buried, Schmidt made the bizarre claim that he'd only made them to get people off his back, since he had regularly been accused both playfully and seriously of being Misty's murderer. Reuben went on to show other violent tendencies, being accused of assault in 1996 and having his wife file a restraining order against him in 2006 after he threatened to burn her house down. It was also later discovered that, for some reason, Reuben had sold his car in the aftermath of Misty's disappearance. When confronted about this by police, he had no legitimate reason for doing so, but again, this highly suspicious little factoid seems to have been completely glossed over. And once again, the most obvious suspects seem to have escaped any concrete charges. But then again, maybe that's because there are just so many other plausible suspects. For example, for anyone investigating missing girls in 90s-era Pacific Northwest, to not include Gary Ridgway as a suspect would verge on grossly incompetent. The Green River Killer confessed to no less than 71 different murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Yet for a man who was apparently so open and honest about his depravity, Ridgway flatly denied having anything to do with Misty's murder, and the area she vanished from was well out of Ridgway's regular stalking ground. Then there's convicted kidnapper Robert Hickey, who was sentenced for a separate crime shortly after Misty vanished. He served several years in prison only to commit a crime of similar depravity once he was released from prison. Seeing him as an irredeemable threat to society, a judge then sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Hickey was apparently driving a red Camaro at the time of Misty's disappearance, which may well account for a series of red paint chips found on her body. Yet when confronted by police, he denied having killed or abducted her, and officers must have been satisfied with whatever alibi he had to offer because he was soon dropped as a suspect. It seems that a tragic combination of minimal information, unreliable witnesses, and a weak investigation meant Misty Copsey's killer might never be brought to justice. Misty's mother had a few choice words for the Puyallup PD, saying their failure to arrest and convict Reuben Schmidt was a catastrophic blunder, and that they should have gotten to work finding her much sooner instead of waiting months to interview key witnesses. In recent years, the Puyallup Police Department, as well as the local sheriff's office, have revitalized public information campaigns in hopes that renewed interest in the case may bring forth new and pertinent information. The use of DNA analysis may be able to reveal new information regarding Misty's disappearance. Although it's been over 20 years since she vanished, Misty's mother is still desperate for answers. Someone, somewhere, must know something, she was quoted as saying. So please, I'm begging you, if you know what happened to my daughter, please call the Puyallup PD. But it seems the only person who really knows the truth of Misty's fate is the one who buried her. And if the past 30 years are anything to go by, her killer certainly won't be revealing himself anytime soon. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. So this was kind of a long one that takes place when I was a student at UTEP. That's the University of Texas at El Paso, for those of you that didn't know. And it happens to be one of the best places to study engineering in the entire country, let alone the Southwest. But what many of you will know is that El Paso is right across from the Rio Grande from its sister city, Ciudad Juarez. Back in the early 90s, there was none of the beefed-up border security that exists now. Sure, the cartels were operating, and maybe I'm just remembering this through rose-tinted glasses, but there just wasn't the same kind of senseless violence that affects the region today. The students that lived in El Chuco, what many Mexicans called El Paso, had a lot of respect and love for Juarez, for one big reason: the drinking age. In a place where the drinking age was and is 21, we were like an hour's drive away from a foreign country where we could drink tequila and Corona until we passed out, and no one would bat an eyelid. Getting over the border was a piece of cake, too. I can't speak for today, but back then you could just park your car on the American side, walk over a bridge, pay the toll, and boom, you're in liquor heaven. And now you understand why UTEP gets some of the highest application numbers in the country. About the same time I was making my college applications, a buddy of mine went off to join the Marine Corps. We hadn't seen each other for years, so when he got back from a deployment to the Gulf, we organized for him to come down to El Paso for some much-needed catching up. Only, he too had heard about the drinking age loophole and was insistent that we take advantage of it. Naturally, I agreed. So we're over in Juarez, getting hammered and jamming with this mariachi band in some dive bar, having the time of our lives. And somehow we get separated. At this time, I should add that I'd only ever been over to Juarez myself like twice previously, so it's not like I know my way around too well. Stupidly, I decide to go looking for my buddy. Thanks to the booze, I can't quite remember how, but I ended up in this big square that's hosting a large gathering of people. Me being drunk assumes that this is just some kind of party, so off I go to join in with the revelry and practice my bad drunk Spanish. Only it's not a party at all. And although the bad vibes come a little too late, boy, they hit hard. I remember trying to just get out of the crowd, feeling super panicky when I came across a large truck, Policia, stenciled on the side. There were Mexican cops just tossing people into the back, beating them with batons before bundling them inside. I'll never forget the way this cop looked at me, pure hatred in his eyes as he lunged toward me. I'm not Latino or anything, but I do have dark hair and brown eyes, not exactly the most obvious gringo imaginable. So the fear I felt when I realized this cop just assumed I was a Mexican rioter or something, Jesus Christ, I'll never forget that feeling of helplessness. Yo soy americano, por favor, no. Por favor, yo soy americano. I screamed, but my accent always was horrible. The cop didn't understand. Maybe he did, but he just didn't care. But his only response was to beat me with the black baton he held tight in his fist. Before I knew it, I was stuffed into the back of a hot, stuffy police wagon with the group of terrified Mexicans. You have no idea how much it sucked, sobering up inside an overcrowded Mexican jailhouse where I could barely understand a single thing anyone was saying. From what I can remember, it was just this huge, concrete monstrosity on the outskirts of the city, and it was not like any U.S. county jail I'd ever heard of. Instead of smaller cells or whatever, they basically just had these huge caged-off yards that seriously had like hundreds of dudes thrown into them. I mean, some were like half a football field and still seemed overcrowded. At first, I thought I might be in luck, that they discovered that I was an American tourist during the booking process and send me on my way. No harm done. My heart sank when I realized that there was no booking process as such, that they just throw you in with hardened criminals and deal with you when they're good and ready. I was screwed. I was pretty sure I'd end up getting beaten up, stabbed, or worse. But I was wrong, and thank God I was wrong. The only dudes who bothered to pay attention to me were just curious as to how I'd ended up there. Otherwise, the other prisoners just talked and sometimes fought amongst themselves. My new amigos and myself could barely communicate, but thanks to the little bit of Spanish I took in high school, I could sort of get by. They offered me smokes and through a series of complex hand gestures established that they'd have my back for the presumably short time that I'd be there. Shout out to Miguelito. You're probably not reading this, but I'm eternally grateful. I end up being let out in the morning when they finally bring me out for booking. I thought the cops might be at least a little apologetic, but nope. They didn't care. Just sort of shrugged before showing me the door. So I'm a mess when they let me out of the jail. I'm hungover, I've not slept at all, and I'm a nervous wreck from the entire experience. All I can think about is getting to the border and getting home. I mean, I worry briefly about my Marine buddy, but then I remember he'd been to war and could probably look after himself. I know it was selfish, but like I said, I was in a bad way. Only when I got to the toll bridge to get back to the States do I tap my pockets and realize, at some point during my stay in the jail, somebody had stolen my wallet and passport. I thought I was going to empty my stomach right then and there. I mean, when people talk about feeling sick with fear or whatever, that stuff is for real. I know it wasn't the case, but in those few moments I thought I'd be stuck in Mexico for the foreseeable future. Now, I do love Mexico, but it is not the place to be stuck with no money and barely any Spanish, and there was no way I was going to spend a night on the streets in Juarez. So, with my heart in my mouth, I started walking towards the toll booth, hoping he might take pity on me and believe my story. Sometimes I think that the craziest part about the whole thing is that border security actually did believe me. They cross-checked some stuff, called the UTEP to ensure that I was in fact a student there, then just let me pass. Turns out that the whole losing your passport thing happens way more than I'd first thought. I think I was just too exhausted and scared to show any real emotion. I just trudged back to my car and drove back into El Paso, promising myself that I would never, ever drink tequila again. Back when I was a student, I went on a university-sponsored trip to Singapore. With over 5 million people of varying ethnic backgrounds packed onto a small island off the coast of Malaysia, Singapore is one of the world's last great city-states. Everything about the trip was just phenomenal. A pure sensory assault for a bumpkin from the Midwest like me. Singapore is a foodie's heaven. Street food hawker culture was practically born there, and the locals take a great deal of pride in preserving traditional recipes that have been around for literally hundreds of years. It's clean, there's very little crime, and despite having a reputation as a heaving metropolis, the island has a handful of nature reserves and public parklands where the masses can detox from city life for a few hours before returning to the fray. It's paradise. At least, it was, until the last night we were there. Being the last night, we decided to head over to Clarke Quay, which happens to be Singapore's main attraction when it comes to nightlife. It's a little more upmarket, with the kind of clubs that do bottle service and VIP booths, but we figured since we'd be slumming it all summer that we should go out with a bang. Clark's is a bit of a walk from the rented apartment I was sharing with my other people on our course, so we were stopping into little bars along the way, and by the time we got there, we were smashed. It was a brilliant night. Singapore never ceases to be a feast for the senses, but it was wild. We all drank way too much, and the last thing I remember is getting into a taxi after puking up a bunch of flavored vodka. I'm not entirely sure how I got into my apartment, but I must have done okay, because a couple of hours later I woke up fully clothed, in my own bed, reeking of vomit and booze. It was my phone buzzing irritatingly against the bedside table, caller restricted showing on the screen as I picked it up. Confused, I answered groggily, asking who was on the other end. I didn't recognize the voice. It certainly wasn't one of my fellow exchange students, and in fairly broken English, the voice on the other end asked if I knew two people he named. They were both the names of the people I shared the flat with. When I answered yes, people on the other end of the line began talking in Malay to each other. I couldn't understand what they were saying at all, so I asked again who was calling. The Malay man refused to give me his name or the location of my friends. All he would say was that he was with them and that they were alive, for now. The words chilled my blood, and with my head spinning from the hangover, I assumed the worst. They had been kidnapped. They had gotten blind, drunk, and lost in Singapore, and had managed to get themselves kidnapped by the local mafia. That's when I freaked out. I started shouting down the phone, telling them that I was going to call the police, that they'd be dead men if they laid a hand on my friends, that I was an American and I'd make sure that they'd be in prison for the rest of their lives for this kidnap. The guy just laughed. Honestly, the eeriest, most spine-chilling laugh that I'd ever heard in my life. And what he said next made my head hurt. "We are the police, sir. Your friends have been arrested." So it turns out that a pair of our numbers stupidly decided in their drunken stupor to walk back to the hotel along the waterfront. Unbeknownst to them, they ended up wandering into some highly restricted military area around Singapore Harbor. How they even got into somewhere like that is beyond me, but according to the police, that's just what they did. They're wandering around like morons, making a bunch of noise and generally being idiots, when, out of nowhere, a bunch of Singapore Marines surrounded them with weapons drawn and take them into custody. They hand them over to internal security, Singapore's equivalent of the FBI, where they're basically going to be charged with spying for a foreign power. They were separated and interrogated. One guy said guns were pulled on them in order to get them to fess up. They were taken to the walls of the port and forced to explain how they scaled them, even asking if they had left any surveillance equipment behind the harbor. One cop told one friend that the other friend had already confessed, so they might as well confess too. All kinds of horrific, barely legal stuff was pulled on them, probably just to make an example of a couple of drunk Americans. When the police hung up on me, I called around the rest of the foreign students to tell them what had happened. It caused a full-on panic. The police over in Singapore can be particularly brutal and cruel, as I knew too well, and there was a rush to ensure that our two arrested friends wouldn't end up like that kid in North Korea that got beat up so bad that he died. I'm not comparing the two countries, but I don't know. We were panicking, like really panicking. We were calling up every police station in Singapore as well as the American embassy, asking everyone we could if they knew the fate of our friends. We had also made quite an extensive number of friends and contacts during our time there, and despite what our arrested friends experienced, Singaporeans can be exceptionally friendly, welcoming, and loyal. Our local friends went to work for us, using their knowledge to get to the heart of the problem. We think someone messed up their job at the port that day, left a gate open, and rather than admit fault, they would get these young students to take the fall. Thankfully, neither of them gave up because, God knows, the punishment for espionage in Singapore at the time was most definitely death. I suppose this story isn't as scary as some of the others, ones that involve actual local crimes, murders, and the like. Maybe none of us were really in danger, but the feeling of powerlessness we felt that night, the pure fear of realizing just how small we really are, how helpless we can be, I'll never forget that. So please, if you go traveling or on vacation to someplace far, far from home, be on your best behavior. Not everywhere is as free or as fair as the United States, as terrifying. as that may sound. Have you guys heard of Murphy's Law? It's the rule that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And boy, is that a real thing. A couple of years back, I was in Bogota, Panama with a close friend of mine. First night there, we went out drinking with a group of people we'd met at the hostel we were staying in. I met a girl, we got talking, and well, we happened to find ourselves looking for a quiet spot to get some personal time in. You see where I'm going with this. We're walking and chatting, just being drunk and silly as we're wandering along this dusty road when we come to a gas station and realize we're pretty lost. I decide I'll go in, buy some smokes, then ask the attendants there how to get back to our hostel. So I'm inside, drunkenly fluctuating between Spanish and English with the two attendants when the girl I'm with pops inside. Apparently she's found us someone who will take us back to the hostel, so I apologize to the attendants without getting directions and follow her outside into the forecourt. Only it's not a taxi that the girl has found. It's just some Panamanian woman with a white Chevy. But I'm not one to refuse the kindness of a stranger, so at first I don't make anything of it and just get into the car. But when I look at the driver, I start realizing that what we did was a very bad idea. She looked high as a kite, and I'm pretty sure I could see a little coke dust around her nostrils. But by that time, she'd already driven off, and it was sort of too late to say anything. Not only that, but her car reeked of alcohol. I mean, it seriously smelled like a distillery in there. After some driving around, it becomes obvious that the woman is completely nuts. She actually starts doing coke while she's driving, in between rants in Spanish that seem to verge on manic episodes. Me and my gal pal are a little put off and ask to be let out. Driver pulls over and the girl, who is sitting in the front, jumps out. I'm just about to follow suit when the driver turns to me and says in plain English, "I lost my kids today. Stay with me a little while, will you?" This was a few years ago, and I have grown up a lot since, but drunk me decided that I was making a great decision by staying in the car. I'm on the edge of blackout in a brand new town, and so, for a while, I don't notice that this drunken woman is driving me way out of town. She makes a phone call, and then a few minutes later she pulls the car to the side of the road. I'm not joking when I say the largest man I had ever seen gets into the back of the car. He's Panamanian and thugged out from head to toe. He has dead eyes and coldly stares at me without saying a word. My drunk white Canadian self is sitting in the front seat. Through the liquor haze, my brain is screaming, "Dude, you're in Panama. No one knows where you are. You're alone with this terrifying human who hasn't spoken a word and a clearly messed up cokehead girlfriend." So I pull out my phone, thinking now is a good time to get a hold of my buddy back at our hostel, but it's dead. Yep, I'd forgot to lock the screen before putting it in my pocket, and it had died. Stuff like that is why I hardly drink anymore. So we are driving further and further out of town. The houses are getting big and spread out. We pull into a house that has Greek columns in the entryway, and I am thinking to myself that I've been kidnapped. I'm absolutely terrified at this point, and maybe because I was so scared, but I just got out of the car and followed her inside. I didn't want to do anything crazy. I had no idea how she'd react if I just ran away. She takes me inside of this huge house that's just dripping with drug dealer chic. I mean, it really did look like whoever owned the place was trying to build a replica of the Tony Montana mansion from Scarface. Marble columns everywhere, huge garnish paintings of tigers and stuff like that. We walk into one room where, sat at this huge dining table, is this really twitchy-looking Panamanian dude. He rises to greet me like we're long-lost friends or something, calling me brother and actually hugging me. I knew he could tell how out of depth I was, and I got the impression he was enjoying it. He offered me coke, weed, you name it. I politely declined them all and in a very roundabout way asked why I'd been brought here. He cuts to the chase and tells me he's a very successful drug runner with a network of contacts from Panama City to Michoacan, and that he has a favor to ask me. You know the way cartoon characters do like a big gulp when they're anxious or scared? Not a cliché. that actually happens, and the Panamanian drug runner has to stifle his laughter when it happened to me. He tried to calm me down, assure me it wasn't a big deal, but then, without breaking a sweat, he explained that he wanted me to smuggle a kilo into the States for him. I think I just totally zoned out when he was explaining how I'd do it, imagining myself in an orange jumpsuit, my parents quietly crying as my sentences read out. There was no way I could go through with something like that, but I didn't think that was what my host wanted to hear. I pretended I was into the idea, asking how much money I'd make from the run, whereabouts in the vehicle you could hide so much. Then I told him I'd be back in touch within a couple of days to confirm the departure date. He seemed delighted, gave me a burner cell phone he could call me on, then told the cokehead woman to drive me back into town. The very next day I told the guy I was staying with that I was leaving. I didn't even bother to get in touch with the girl that I'd hooked up with the night before. She was drop-dead gorgeous, and I ghosted on her harder than a gay Casper. I was too scared to keep the phone, but too scared to throw it away. I had gotten it into my head that the runner could use it to track me. I only tossed the thing when I was back over the border in the U.S. Maybe I've watched too much Breaking Bad, but I have zero regrets. I can imagine how much money that guy has, and I know some of the messed up things people will do for money. Besides, he could have employed the weird logic and say I stole from him by not returning the phone. I don't know. I just didn't want to take any chances. I have never been back to Panama since. Sometimes I stop and think of the smallest little actions and how they have huge consequences. Meeting the wrong girl, getting into the wrong car, all can have the most disastrously unimaginable consequences, and I guess next year I'll just try Canada. Today's episode is sponsored by Dashlane. In today's world, everything requires a password. Even worse, each one of these has their own set of very specific requirements. One special character, one number, one capital letter. It's really a mess. I definitely feel this when accessing every form of little social media app login related to running the YouTube channel and podcast. How awesome would it be if you could throw all of these into just one app? That's where Dashlane comes in. Dashlane is a multi-platform and multi-function secure password and digital identity manager that takes the stress out of your everyday login struggle. Gone are the days of remembering an endless list of login credentials, credit card info, and clicking that dreaded forgot password button to reset yours for the 50th time, as this one service can remember them all for you. All it takes is one master password to access your virtual and secure vault that you can add not only logins, but also secured notes, online checkout information, personal ID cards, and contacts. Even better, with Dashlane Premium, you get access to their VPN, dark web monitoring, secure password generation, and complete seamless info synchronization across all of your devices. If password security is important to you online, I highly recommend trying them out. I've been using it for about a month or so now, and it's by far the best password manager that I've used to date. Check out the link in the description, www.dashlane.com/read. That's www.dashlane.com/READ to try it out for free on your first device for life. A few years back, my dad passed pretty suddenly. Heading back to our hometown for the funeral, my two younger sisters and I were reunited for the first time in years. It felt amazing, feeling petty sibling rivalries just fall away once we realized what was truly important, being family. We get chatting on the night of the wake, reminiscing and stuff, when we make the joint decision to go on a family vacation together. A few months down the line, and we've somehow managed to get the three of us to agree on a location, somewhere our dad has always talked about, with great affection, a place called Veradero in Cuba. He'd taken our late mom there on a belated honeymoon a year or so after they'd married, and the place was filled with happy memories for them. Maybe Just maybe we could visit Veradero and feel a connection with her parents' past. So myself and my two sisters, Rose and Jackie, boarded a flight at Toronto Pearson that was headed directly to Havana, Cuba. Seeking to escape another damp, squib Canadian summer for the sun-soaked beaches of the Caribbean. We were excited beyond words. It was the first real vacation any of us had taken in years, and we really had gone all out for it. But it took about an hour before we wanted to leave. We landed in Havana, and the weather is looking like it's about to turn. It was very hot and the sun was sweltering, but on the horizon was the biggest, most intimidating collection of storm clouds I'd ever laid eyes on. I mean, they were huge, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a Hollywood disaster movie. When we met our driver outside the airport, he explained in pretty good English the storm wasn't expected to hit Cuba too hard and that it should be cleared up by morning. And he was wrong. Over the course of the 2-hour drive to Veradero, the storm began to encroach, so that by the time we reached the actual resort, heavy winds had been battering the buildings to the point that the roof tiles were scattered all over the place. We were getting pretty concerned by this point, but the resort bar is still open and doing good business thanks to the weather, so we decided to grab a few drinks to pass the time. Mojitos, daiquiris, cubanitos. We sampled pretty much everything the menu had to offer us. Big mistake. By the time we leave to go back to our rooms, we're pretty smashed. Spirits are high despite the rain, so we're laughing and joking, singing songs in our bad Spanish, when all of a sudden, Rosie slips on a piece of roofing tile and goes down hard. Well, she doesn't exactly slip. According to her, an initial slip on her flip-flop on a damp, loose piece of tiling causes her footwear to become stuck. This kinda whipped her leg back, causing her to land on it with all her weight. We hear the bone snap as clear as day. It was horrific, but not as horrific as Rosie's screams. It took about 30 minutes of screams, tears, and panicking resort staff before the Cuban ambulance finally showed up. Some people make a big deal about the quality of Cuban healthcare, but I can assure you, the reality is quite different. The ambulance was literally just a can with a wheelchair in the back. No stretcher, no monitors for vital signs, nothing like we were used to back in Canada. What's worse, the driver was a doctor himself. The hospital was short-staffed that their own doctors were forced to drive the emergency vehicles themselves. Speaking of the hospital, we were horrified to find out that the closest clinic was over 45 minutes away in a place called Matanzas, and when we get there, it's worse than we could have imagined. The whole place is flooded thanks to the rainstorm, and we certainly weren't the only ones to suffer an accident because of it. The place was heaving with wounded and injured people. There were bloody palm prints on the walls, smears of blood on the floors where people had been dragged inside. The hospital staff were working so hard, but if there just wasn't enough of them, every single one was rushed off their feet, looking like they were about to snap under the pressure. Rose is still groaning in pain as we wheel her down flooded corridors. The doctors driving the ambulance were very kind and his English was almost perfect, but he just didn't have the medicine to properly dull Rose's pain. What's worse, we were doing all of this in our bikini tops. Nothing but wrap-around towels to cover up our lower halves. All these Cubans kept looking at us like crazy gringos or whatever, wondering why we were dressed for a party in what was obviously a crisis. The whole thing was stressful and embarrassing. We hadn't even converted our money yet. When the staff wheel Rose into the X-ray room, my jaw drops at how terrible a condition the machine is. It looks like it was made in the 50s or something. It's ginormous, rusted, and looked like it might come crashing down on whoever was unfortunate enough to be under it at the wrong time. Another doctor arrives. They complete the X-ray. Then the doctor tells us they're going to try to set Rose's broken leg without any anesthetic. I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. None of us could quite believe what he just said, but in his similarly near-perfect English, he explained that the hospital was short on anesthesia and were saving it for high-priority patients. What could be worse than a broken leg? We weren't sure, but the doctor was insistent that Rose would not be receiving any anesthesia. I cannot begin to describe the screams I heard. Jackie and I became so upset that a hospital security guard forced us to wait outside the room. The only seat available was next to an unconscious Cuban man. He was barely breathing, his head lolling back into his chair. I was pretty sure he was dying. Finally, after they set her leg, the doctor administers propofol just to knock Rosie out cold. They then explained they don't have the tools to perform any complex surgery required to properly set Rosie's leg, and we needed to get home, and fast. The next flight back wasn't until 8 p.m. the next night. Add the fact that the only wheelchair on the resort was too small to barely function. Our dream vacation had literally turned into a waking nightmare of pain, sleeplessness, and soul-crushing panic. We made it back in one piece, but Rose now has a permanent steel rod in her thigh and has been strongly advised to have gastric bypass surgery in order to reduce to a weight her weak leg can support. Please be very, very careful when you're on vacation. Many areas of the world are not nearly as fortunate as we are, and it can be quite a shock when you're face to face with that sort of deprivation. I would hate to think that anyone would have to suffer like my sister did, ever again. I was 19 when I first landed in Ho Chi Minh City, barely a grown man. Before that, I'd never even left the UK, and Vietnam seemed like the most exotic place in the world to me. Feeling like Neil Armstrong landing on an alien planet, the humidity that hit me in the face as I stepped off the airplane was unbelievable. How could people live in that heat? I couldn't even imagine. But live they did. In tiny, arterial streets and wide sunflower-lined avenues, millions upon millions of Vietnamese made their way around the city on little mopeds and scooters. My cigarette-smoking taxi driver filled the car with thick, billowing fumes, beeping the horn so regularly that it could have been Morse code. I recoiled when he began bellowing viciously out of the window in Vietnamese at any two-wheelers that came in too close. It was a sensory overload. Alien sights and unfamiliar noises, exotic scents both putrid and pleasurable. It was almost a relief to arrive at the small, dingy hostel I'd be staying at for at least a couple of nights. I quickly developed a taste for Vietnamese food. Loud, vibrant flavors and some strangely familiar forms. Vietnamese beer was pretty good too, yet it was the night that brought Saigon to life. Neon signs and blaring speakers from shrines and temples. Vietnamese go-go dancers gyrating to lyrics they couldn't understand. Fried meat and incense filling the air with sweet, delicious smells. Street vendors sold fruits that looked like props from a science fiction movie. It was incredible. But maybe I got a little too confident in my new home away from home. So Vietnamese weed is cheap, like really bloody cheap. Not as strong as some of the stuff you can find in the UK and the States, but for the price, it's fantastic. It's also readily available. You can rock up to some little Vietnamese dive bar and pay the bartender to nip out and grab you a bag. It's really that easy. Only this one night, my usual connection isn't in work. I try to ask the owner where the bartender is in my crappy Vietnamese, but he doesn't understand, so I give up and decide to find myself a new person to pick up from. Something you should know about Ho Chi Minh. It's not uncommon for someone on a moped or a scooter to just cruise up next to you on the pavement and offer you a lift somewhere. They'll be like, "Hey man, you want beers, ladies, weed, ecstasy?" Most people just laugh and decline politely, with the Viet hustlers just taking it on the chin and shouting bye-bye as they drive off. But when this dude rolls up and gives me the same routine, I nod and ask him if we can drive me somewhere to buy some smoke. As I expect, he smiles, nods, and tells me to hop on. After we're driving for about 15 minutes, I notice that we're actually heading out of the city center. Not just that, but we seem to be heading way out into the suburbs, which in Vietnam is basically just jungle with houses interspersed between thick patches of foliage. I didn't mind the journey really, as long as he didn't try and gouge me for it, and find much more quality stuff if you go out into the country where there's not as much demand. My driver says we're headed to a bar he knows, but when we pull into the driveway of this bar, it's anything but. It's literally just someone's house, a 2-story building with like a porch out front. He tells me we've arrived and I should wait on the porch for him to get my gear for me. Me being me, I just sort of assumed I either misheard the guy or there's been some other kind of miscommunication, probably on my part. So I do as he says, sitting in a white plastic chair on this house's porch while the owner comes out and starts talking to the driver. But when he sees me, he's absolutely effing fuming. He starts growling stuff at the driver, pointing at me and then at the driver. I didn't need to speak Vietnamese to know that I'm definitely not welcome here. But to my confusion, the two just go inside and leave me be. I'm getting pretty impatient after about 20 minutes goes by and I'm still just sat there, waiting on these two guys to come out with my smoke. Worried I'm being ripped off, I get up out of the seat and start wandering towards the doorway of the house, trying to get a look inside. But there's noise at the entranceway to the driveway. 4 youngish Vietnamese guys are staggering up the path, obviously pretty drunk. When they see me, they make the older owner's reaction look tame. They're not happy to see me, drunkenly jabbering in Vietnamese and making some pretty aggressive hand gestures. I'm backing off up the porch, hand raised before me like this I'm no threat to anyone kind of way, but they just sense the weakness and ramp it up. One is pushing me, the other is actually trying to stick his hand in my pockets to rob me. All the while the other two are like half goading them on and half trying to throw punches and kicks at me through the melee. I'm convinced I'm about to be robbed and battered by a gang of angry Viets, and that I'll have to walk hours back into Ho Chi Minh without a penny to my name. And that's when I hear it. There was this loud, echoing crack that caused the Viet lads to scatter away from me. I look up and the older owner of the house has stood there holding a bloody, smoking gun in the air. He then proceeds to aim it at the gang of Vietnamese lads, screaming stuff in Viet at them as they back up the driveway, absolutely bricking it. I honestly thought he was about to shoot one of them, right in front of me, and as much as I'm kind of ashamed to admit it, I sort of wanted him to. I actually found myself wanting this fella to just smoke one of those absolute ratbags trying to pick on some lonely, lost Westerner. I hate bullies, I always have. These fellas just legged it up the drive though, tails between their legs. I'm still shaking as the owner starts talking to me in Vietnamese. I have no idea what he's saying, but it's some kind of sort of explanation for what just happened. To this day I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm guessing they were just some neighborhood thugs, come to pick up some smoke as I had, who decided that they didn't like what they saw. Simple as that. With trembling hands, I take this huge bag from the owner, who then refuses to take my money off me. He's batting it away and pushing my hand back towards me, in this really overt gesture of keep this, you probably need it right now. And I did. You have no idea how scary it is when something like that happens in a foreign country. The feeling of utter confusion, helplessness, and fear are amplified because you stick out like a sore thumb. The one thing worse than some horrible misfortune is horrible misfortune you're not able to ask for help with. For my 18th birthday, my mom and dad organized a trip to Ireland for me and 2 friends. My dad's family had emigrated to Canada after the Second World War, and my mom also had some Irish blood, so it was always a dream of mine to visit the old country to gain a greater connection with our cultural past. My dad actually still has relatives in Belfast, in the far north of Ireland, which is technically still part of the UK, and still keeps in touch with them. So a big part of the trip was connecting with these relatives, having them show us around, treating us to some traditional Irish delicacies, like Guinness and, more Guinness. So after about a week or so of touring, Dublin, Limerick, and Cork, we headed up north via train to stay with my distant cousins in Belfast. The meetup wasn't scheduled until the early evening, and it was still quite early in the morning when our train arrived. So me and my 2 girlfriends ended up having some time to kill. Turns out Belfast is pretty cool, with a lot of stuff to see and do, so we had no worries about keeping occupied until the evening. So we're out doing a little shopping and seeing some sights when this young-looking guy walks up to us out of nowhere and strikes up a conversation. Being young girls, a cute Irish guy talking to us turned us into blushing idiots. He's telling us how he's not from Belfast, that he's only in town to do a music video shoot for his band. This now turns the fawning factor up to 11, and we're practically drooling over this tattooed Lothario as he regales us with tales of tour bus antics and wild rock shows. Eventually, to our absolute delight and amazement, he tells us we're all gorgeous and that we're perfect to star in their music video with them. He explains it'll be like a group thing, with a band playing in the abandoned warehouse space while their fans party around them. So when he asks us if we have an hour or 2 to spare to come and be part of the shoot, we jump at the chance. He asks us to follow him, and without so much as a second thought, we do. But here's the thing. I've always been a good judge of character, and something didn't quite feel right to me. I don't know what it was at the time, but something just didn't add up. I also know a little bit about guitars, having played for a few years in high school. I'm not amazing or anything, but I do know my way around a fretboard. So when the guy says he plays guitar in his band, I asked him which model and brand he prefers. He hesitates, then gives us some wishy-washy answer about having too many favorites to really choose from. Okay, nothing quite so suspicious about that. The guy must have had a whole bunch of guitars on hand. But I pressed the issue. I asked him if he'd ever played a genuine Les Paul, and he honestly looks at me like I'm speaking Greek. My BS detector is going off the scales at that. Everyone who plays guitar has some dream set up in mind, some god-tier piece of gear that they've longed to have placed on a pedestal. This guy had nothing. In fact, I was starting to think he knew nothing about guitars at all. I think he actually began to notice my suspicion, and this caused him to drop a little of that happy-go-lucky disposition of his. The guy actually started walking much faster through the crowds, turning around every so often to tell us to hurry up or we'll be late for the shoot. I turned to the girls around this time to tell them that I really didn't like where this was going. While they understood my concerns, they just thought I was being overly paranoid, that I should relax and see where the adventure would take us. But when he eventually leads us all the way to his run-down-looking warehouse building that did not look at all safe, they started getting similar vibes. There's garbage everywhere, gnarly-looking graffiti all over the walls. The place looked like it was a junkie's paradise. Remember, this is in the middle of the day and there's a ton of people around. Well, now we're way out of sight from the general public with this shady stranger who I'm convinced is up to no good. At these big iron entrance doors, he stops, waits, and then tells us to go ahead of him. The other 2 girls are giggling, way excited at the prospect of starring in some foreign band's music video, and just obey him like a pair of idiots. "Girls, we're not going in there. We're leaving." The words seemed to leave my mouth before I'd even realized I'd spoken them. At this point, the guy freaks out and stands in between me and my friends, trying to block their exit from the warehouse. You can see the fury in his eyes. Whatever nefarious plan he'd had for us, I'd obviously just thrown a spanner in the works. He's so overcome with anger that he's hissing at me not to ruin this for him, like flecks of spittle are flying from his lips and landing on me. It was disgusting. So gross, in fact, that I actually lean into a push, sent him flying off balance before I scream at my friends to get out of there. It takes him acting like a complete idiot for my friends to realize just what a scumbag this guy was, and at that, we're running away from his warehouse like it's on fire. The guy is yelling after us, shouting stuff about us not ruining this for him. This just makes us think he's giving chase, so we run faster and faster until we're back among the throngs of people, relative safety. I couldn't believe how dumb we were, and I told the girls as much. We swore we wouldn't tell any of the family what we had done. I have no clue what surprise was waiting for us inside that filthy warehouse space. I realized in that moment how naive I was, and to listen to my intuition which has protected me many, many times throughout my life. What a bunch of idiots we were. After our university graduation, a few close friends and I decided to go traveling to Western Australia. We had planned the trip for years, putting away savings for our part-time jobs until the day we finally donned our mortarboard caps and ventured out into the world as adults. We arrived in country, spent a week or so just lazing around the beaches and soaking up the sun, then decided we'd have ourselves a little road trip. And for that, we'd need wheels. So we wandered into this little Aussie town and find ourselves the cheapest, noisiest camper van and rent the thing for basically pennies. We drove this battered old camper van around a few towns, often sleeping in the van itself when we were unable to find any hostels or hotels. Anyone familiar with the northwestern corner of Australia knows that town is a pretty generous term for most of these places, and there's a lot of absolutely nothing in between them. Just barren outback desert. One night, after driving for hours and hours in almost pitch darkness, we decided it would be better to just pull over and get some sleep instead of risking getting lost in the outback. So we stop, drive off the road a little into this little dry patch of nowhere with no one around for miles and miles. We're tired, but we're happy. We're stocked up on food, cold beer, and now we've got ourselves a place to sleep. We've got it made. So after an hour or so around a warm fire, drinking and reminiscing about uni, we find ourselves staring up at the sky. It's an incredible vista. Lack of light pollution in that area of Australia means that the starlight canopy is a truly mesmerizing sight. But the place we're settled into is ringed by trees, so at some point, someone has the bright idea to go for a little wander so we can get a better view of the stars. It wasn't hard to find a good spot. The only trees around were nestled between the hills, hiding from the sun and sucking up any water that flowed their way. Manage to drag yourself up one of the slopes and you can see for miles and miles. I mean, Australia is so flat in places that it's like you're looking out to the ends of the earth. So with all of us a little buzzed, we start shuffling off towards one of these hills. It was glorious. The Milky Way was so bright and deep it felt like you were falling into it. The road and our campsite were hidden by darkness and trees, erasing pretty much all signs of civilization. We felt so alone, so far from home, it really was a special moment. We sat and drank in the galaxy and told whatever stories came to mind, just real hippie stuff. We were tiny specks in an immense universe and everything was perfect. And then it was time to go. We all stand up and as one, the 4 dudes I'm with start walking in the wrong direction. It's not hard to understand why. Every hill looked like the same from up on top of our glorious mound of rocks and dirt. Every little valley was choked with brush. The road was obscured from view and it curved gently away from us in both directions anyway. There were no landmarks and we were all high as kites. So there I am, confused at first as to why my mates are heading off in pretty much the opposite way we came. I doubt myself for a moment, wondering if it's me that in fact has the messed up sense of direction. The guys poke up a bit of fun, saying I'm too drunk to find my way back to the van, but I know at this point that we're definitely not going the right way. I start insisting, raising my voice, trying to convince the lads that they're about to get themselves dangerously lost in a place where getting lost can be fatal. They were so certain that they were going the right way that my objections were often met with laughter and mockery, but as time went on I became increasingly panicked. I could see this whole disastrous event unfolding before my eyes, so in a moment of clarity I just turned around and headed back in the direction I knew was correct. Now it was their turn to be insistent. The lads practically begged and pleaded with me not to go back in the wrong direction, drunkenly arguing that I was going to get us all in a lot of trouble. That infuriated me. The only one with any idea of where we were, and I was being treated like a moron. Eventually, they decided to humor me, following my lead so that they could continue to mock me when I finally did get us all lost. Every step of the way, they pointed out how unfamiliar everything was, how it couldn't possibly be the way we came. One of the lads even started babbling about how we were going south when we really wanted to be going north. He didn't even have a compass on him. In fact, I'm pretty sure that even if he did, he still wouldn't be able to tell his mouth from a hole in the ground. They left broken twigs and a trail behind us so we could find our way back, an idea that would have served us a whole lot better an hour or two beforehand. The one dude tried to physically drag me back to the hill and into the wilderness. They laughed at me, right up until we stepped out of a ditch and into the clearing where our camper van was set up. They weren't laughing then, I can tell you that much. The lad who was insistent that he had some kind of magnetic compass in his head was the worst off. He seemed flabbergasted, like the only explanation was that the camp had moved, not that we'd nearly gotten ourselves lost. I looked up this rest area later on Google Earth. Had we gone in any direction other than directly back to the road, it would have been over 120 miles before we hit any signs of civilization. If we were very, very lucky, 120 miles of Australian outback with no food, water, or tools. We'd have died, surely, and it only takes a few days without water before the body just packs in, and we were so dehydrated from the alcohol and smokes that I don't think that we'd have lasted a day alone in the outback. And that's the story of why I don't hike with drunks anymore. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. All links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Anthony is the captain now. And don't be narcissistic. For some background, I am not your typical repo man by looking at me. Most guys I work with are over 6'3", 200 to 300 pounds, bald with a beard. I know it sounds specific, but it really holds true in my experience. I, on the other hand, am 5'11", 155 pounds, but I do have a beard. I was out working during the day and checking a retail location for a vehicle I'd been searching for. The address I was checking was located in a large mall area. I glanced in my rearview mirror to see a red Ford Focus behind me. He made a few of the same turns I did, but I didn't think twice about it. After the 7th or 8th turn that he mimicked, I decided to pull into a parking spot. I figured he would either move on or come talk to me, if that was his goal. I noticed he was on the phone in my rearview. I parked the truck and watched the car as it parked about 50 feet from me. Okay, fine. I noticed the man driving the Focus was staring and pointing at me as he spoke on the phone, so I decided to ask what his deal was. When I approached, he got out of his vehicle, which was alarming, so I backed off and didn't get closer. I leaned my head out my open window and said, "Sir, is there a reason you're following me?" He moves his phone from his ear, covering the microphone, and yells, "Yeah, you're harassing people on private property. Cops are on their way." I told him that was fine, and I would wait around to speak to the police. He yelled some more unintelligible nonsense as I put my window up and sat pretty, waiting for the police. A few minutes later, a cruiser shows up behind me. The officer approached my window and we spoke about the situation. I told him that I'm permitted on private property unless I'm explicitly asked to leave by someone who owns the property or works security, which he agreed with. Long story short, the police told me I was good to go and asked that I not engage this man as I left. I complied and planned to move on with my day. About 20 minutes after all of this, I glanced in my rear view to see the same Ford Focus driving a couple of cars behind me. So I parked again, out of frustration. I immediately exited my truck and lit a cigarette. The man driving this car screeched up beside me and exited his car without putting it in park, rather putting it in neutral. As his car begins to roll away, he is turned away from it, screaming at me about violating his right to privacy and harassing the public at this mall. I calmly told him that I was already cleared by the police department and that I was losing patience. I told him he needed to leave right then before I called the police. It was at this point that his vehicle struck the concrete base of a light pole and stopped. He started screaming and saying I crashed his car. I told him I had a dash cam and the footage would completely negate that claim. That's when he charged me. Now remember, I'm not a big guy, but I've dealt with plenty of confrontation at this job, and this guy did not appear coordinated at all. I stepped out of his path and guided him to the ground, telling him to stay down while I leave and to leave me alone. I got in my truck and left. Looking back, I absolutely should have called the police again, as I've gotten the officer's cell phone number and badge number. This story all comes to a head 2 nights later in a bizarre turn of events that genuinely scared me. At the time, I had just gotten married to my lovely wife, and we were living in our little 1-bedroom in our hip little suburb of a major Midwest city. It was a Friday night, and I decided I would go grab some beers for the wife and I to enjoy after a long week. As I was leaving the store with our booze, I saw a maroon Ford Focus in the parking lot, seemingly unoccupied. I made a mental note of the coincidence given the bizarre ordeal a couple of days prior, but didn't think much more of it. As I pulled into my apartment's parking lot, the Focus pulled in behind me. I hadn't noticed it following me up until this point. I live on the 3rd floor, so I decided I was going to hustle up the steps just in case this was the same guy, and he'd stalked me or something in order to exact his revenge for whatever perceived transgression I'd bothered him with. My plan didn't work. He followed me to my patio where my wife was waiting, again unbeknownst to me. I was apparently not feeling very observant that night, I suppose. And that's when this man snuck up, crouching behind our small fence. Neither of us knew he was there until he said, still hidden from view, "Pretty girl." I snapped to my feet and began to look around when I spotted him. I knew instantly it was him. I immediately ordered my wife to go inside, lock the door, and call the police. When I approached him, he drew a small switchblade and pointed it at my belly. I began to back up with my hands up, saying something along the lines of, "We don't have to do this. What do you want?" He told me he wanted me to call my wife back outside, but that wasn't going to happen. I'd rather be stabbed than expose her to this man, so I told him as much. He lunged at me with a knife, grazing and cutting my side as I attempted to grab and redirect his forearm. Then we went to the ground, where he lost his knife. I got some knees to connect to his head when the police lights became visible and I heard shouting. Long story short, Buddy was arrested, and I provided the badge number and PD of the officer from work a couple of days prior in order to corroborate my claims. I decided to press charges, and as far as I know, he's awaiting a court date. I'm sure I'll have to be involved in it. For 6 months, I lived in the north of Spain. About a week before I was going to move back to Ireland, my friend and I were at my house having dinner and drinking a little. I was renting an apartment in the city, and my roommate was an older lady, maybe in her 50s. I'm 20. That night, my roommate left to go have dinner with her friends. About a minute after she left, someone buzzed our door to be let into the building. I looked at the camera and didn't recognize the woman. She looked to be in her late 20s to early 30s, so I just assumed it was one of my roommate's friends, and she was coming to meet her or something like that. I buzzed her into the building, assuming that they would meet in the lobby. At first I didn't buzz her in because I didn't recognize her, and she walked away from the door. But then I hit the buzzer as soon as she walked away, and then I, myself, walked away from the camera, meaning I couldn't see if she actually entered or not, assuming that if she didn't enter, she would just call or text my roommate. Boy, was I wrong. This woman came up to my apartment building on the 6th floor. She came up just 2 minutes after my roommate left, so I know she didn't take the stairs, and I know they must have seen each other when my roommate got off the lift and the lady got in. Realizing that this is weird, I don't open the door when she rings it. I look through the people just to confirm that it was nobody I knew. At this point, I back away from the door and gesture for my friend to be silent. We creep back to my room, which is at the far side of the apartment, and I begin calling my roommate who isn't picking up. Meanwhile, the lady is incessantly ringing my door. My roommate is not picking up, and my friend is just telling me to open my door. In her mind, it's a woman, so she must be harmless. I tell her she's an idiot for underestimating females. Women can be criminals too. She keeps telling me to open the door, and I refuse. The door keeps ringing. I keep looking at the peephole. At this point, I understand that if she knew my roommate or was looking for someone specific, she would just call or text them. She didn't take out a phone at all. She just stayed eerily silent, didn't call out any names or ask if anyone was home. This was weird to me. I finally get through to my roommate. She says she wasn't expecting anyone and that she doesn't know anyone in that age range. She asks if I'm okay, and I say I'm fine. Now it's been at least 20 minutes. I know the lady knows someone is home because the lights are on, and my understanding is that's why she's not leaving. I continue watching her through the peephole and see her go into the lift for a minute and then come back out again. The lift is really loud, and I would have heard it move. It didn't. She just went in and came out. In my mind, this means someone is in the lift waiting for her, and this screams sketchy to me. After about 40 minutes, she leaves. I run to our hall and flick on the outside camera. The lady left the building with 2 men. They all had backpacks on. I will be eternally grateful for trusting my instincts and not listening to my friend. Sometimes, it's better to be safe than sorry. It happened about a month after I had started my first job at a grocery store. My main job was to be a cashier, however, I was often told to restock, clean, make some back runs, and things like that. Likely I had been canceling my day shifts as I was a senior in school and had lots of assessments to do, so the manager decided to put me up for night shifts. Now, since I was the oldest teenage cashier there, they would often put me up for closing shift along with about 3 others who were all aged well above 20. I was fine with this as the store was much quieter at night and it was really relaxing, honestly. However, one night changed the whole opinion on that. It was a Sunday and I had started my shift at about 5 p.m., with my finishing time set at 10 p.m. Between 5 and 6, we had a big rush of sudden customers, so I was flogged with customer after customer. I was the only employee minding the registers and was placed at the end of the store near the cold produce. Most of the customers were in a general rush and barely looked at me. The last customer, however, did the complete opposite. He had brown eyes and dirty blonde hair and was pretty tall and lean-looking. Earlier, I had noticed him down the aisle, right next to me, staring at me as I served another customer. I suppose he thought I wouldn't notice him out of the corner of my eye. I wrote it off as him maybe having some kind of anxiety disorder or something. When he came up to the register, I repeated the same sentence I had to say to every customer. "Hello, how are you tonight? Would you like a bag?" Most people would answer the question, but no, not him. Instead, he smiled at me weirdly and replied, "You have such a soft voice." This embarrassed me as I was often told I talked too quietly and people couldn't hear me. So I smiled awkwardly, apologized, and asked again if he wanted a bag. He nodded and I turned around, bent down, and reached for my last bag, which was stuffed right at the back of the tiny little holder thing by the register. When I turned back around, the man was leaning slightly over the counter with his chest pointed downwards as if he was looking for something. I paused as we both made eye contact. His smile now slightly faded. I asked him if he had dropped something very harshly, as I was pretty certain I knew what he was trying to see, and he shook his head quietly, taking a step back from the register. I finished serving him and watched him leave before telling my team manager what had happened. He listened silently and told me he was a usual customer and was probably just a weirdo. After that, I sort of pushed the memory aside as I had a lot to do still. Once I had finished my shift and helped turn off all the register lights and clean up, I checked out in the employee room, grabbed my bag, and made my way back to the back exit that led into the back alley. I hated leaving this way alone as it was pretty creepy, but my coworkers had asked me if it was okay if they were to leave and leave the last of the cleaning to me. So I agreed, eager to make a good impression on them. Thus, I was the last person to leave, other than the Night Stalkers. I walked down the alley for a bit before slowing when I noticed a man smoking near a back door to one of the other stores. I was raised to be wary but also not afraid, so I continued to walk while staring at him. As I got closer, I identified the man as the same man who had acted strangely earlier. With no other way to go, I decided to just walk past as fast as I could, as the alley would lead to the street any time now anyways. As I walked past him, he lifted his head and smiled at me once again. I didn't smile back. Now past him, I quickened my pace, and with good reason. The man had begun to follow me. On one occasion, I glanced back at him to be met with another smile and a wink. Too afraid to run, I decided to pick up my phone and pretend to be calling someone, hoping it would turn him off, but it didn't. The man continued to follow me, and I started to panic. I contemplated calling the police, but concluded that if he had heard me, he would immediately attack me and I'd be done, or worse, before they even arrived. To my luck, however, as I rounded the next corner, I spotted two men that had just finished their shift at our neighboring grocer. Once I was near them, I stopped, turned around, and confronted the man. I told him that if he didn't go away, I would call the police, and then I told my coworkers all about him. This grabbed his attention of the other two men, who started to walk towards me and the man. And the man stopped as he had noticed the other two men, and his smile quickly faded again. He turned around without a word and stalked back down the alley as the men began asking me if I was all right. After a short explanation and a lift home, I decided to call my manager the next day and report it. And needless to say, that man is now on our banned list. So I've been working at Wendy's, a popular fast food chain in the US, for a few months now. And while I've had the occasional offhanded comment of, "Wow, you're so beautiful. Do you have a boyfriend? He must be a lucky guy. When are you off? I'd love to take you out." I've never had something like this happen before. So there I was, an hour before my shift was over. I work as a cashier, and the majority of people who come in are old people and construction workers. I have my back turned to the dining room, and I'm putting liners on trays when I hear someone loudly clear their throat. I turn around and apologize and tell them I'm ready to take their order whenever they are ready. The customer is a heavier set man, in his 50s or 60s, whose shirt appears to be covered in either grease stains or sweat. I also noticed the smell of cigarettes was strongly wafting off him, but that kind of thing never really bothered me. Then the conversation goes like this. "Hi there, darling. How's your day going?" "It's going well, ready to be finished with the workday." "Oh, what time are you off?" "I'm a bit uncomfortable with answering that. Can I get you something?" Well, it's just an innocent question. I'm not a creep. Although you are very naturally beautiful, I'm sure you get a lot of weirdos in here. It's refreshing to see a girl your age not wearing any makeup. Are you Spanish? I can tell because of your name." I have a very common Spanish last name, and I am, but I look like a white girl with dark hair. Now me, very obviously uncomfortable. Yeah, I'm half Mexican." "On your mom or dad's side?" At this point, my shift manager comes over because she can see I'm clearly uncomfortable, and there's a line of a few people now behind him. When he sees her walk over, he says, "Uh-oh, you're in trouble." She hears this and asks him if everything's okay, and he says, Sure, just making conversation. Is that against the rules or something? And she responds, No, sir, but you're holding up the line and haven't ordered anything. He makes a face like he's annoyed and orders a small iced tea, pays in change, and the whole time he's just staring intensely at me. It makes me so uncomfortable I start to get red in the face. I continue taking orders while he just sits there staring. Eventually, I tell my manager he's making me uncomfortable and asks if I can go wash trays in the back or do drive-through for the rest of my shift. She says no and reminds me I have to clean the dining room before I leave. I start to walk away and she says, He's probably just a lonely old man, and it's not against the law to stare. This makes me really anxious and annoyed, but I need this job, so I just go grab a rag and start cleaning tables. I try to keep my distance from the man who's sitting in the right corner when he says, Excuse me, little miss. My table isn't clean. Trying to use my best customer service voice, I say, You're welcome to switch to a clean one and I'll wipe that one off. He insists he doesn't have to move and even has the balls to say, Should I go get the manager? If you've ever worked in retail or food service, you know that's the last thing you want to happen, especially if your manager is terrible like mine. So he lifts up his tray and sneers at me while I wipe it from the opposite side and try to stay as far away as possible. He also asks me to go grab him a straw, which is not at all my job, but of course I do it anyway. When I come back and set it on his table, he says something that makes my stomach drop. What's an old man like me gotta do to get you to say yes to a date? I know this isn't just an anxiety thing, but when I start to have a panic attack, I literally can't talk. I get red and hot all over, especially my face, and I shake bad. I could feel it coming, so I just walked away. I went in and told my shift manager that he was being really pushy and that I can't go back out there. She told me I can just leave early. I think she could tell I was near tears. Plus, I had only 20 minutes of my shift and the person taking over was there early. I'm 19 and the whole reason I got this job was to save up for a car. My house is a little less than a mile away and I don't usually mind walking, but today, for obvious reasons, I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I tried calling my boyfriend for a ride because I knew he was off that day, but he was at lunch with his younger sister, and so I downplayed the situation to avoid making him leave like my needy self. I walk on and surprise, surprise, the man is still there. As soon as I walk out, he walks out too. I decide to completely ignore him and begin making my way to the crosswalk next to my work, headphones in. It isn't until he blocks my way that I see he's still trying to talk to me. Need a ride, sweetheart? It's awfully hot out here, he says with a wink that makes my skin crawl. I walk around him and ignore him, pushing the button to cross. He makes this face of horror, like he can't believe I just refuse his offer after clearly showing I'm uninterested. I put my headphones in and blast the volume, but I can see his mouth moving like he's cursing me out, and turns around and gets back in his car. I keep pushing the button as if that will somehow make the walk sign appear faster, desperate to get home and lock the door behind me. When it does, I start to walk without even realizing his car was at the crosswalk and he quickly speeds up, narrowly missing me, and the shock made me fall back on my butt. He speeds off, and I ran across and hit on the small bike trail for 15 minutes before running home and locking the door behind me. I just called the actual manager, different from the shift manager, basically the big boss, and she was much more understanding. She told me that I'm allowed to have someone take my place if he comes in again, and also let all my coworkers know not to give him any info about my shifts. I used to live in a university apartment complex while my parents were studying. This complex had a hill that it was on top of. It was steep enough for kids to take sleds and sled down the hill during the wintertime. At the bottom of this hill there was a small patch of woods. This forest contained a drain to prevent flooding, so back in elementary school, I was hanging out with my friend Daniel during summer break. Daniel was also 2 years older than me, we were over at my apartment playing Mario Kart. Then, my mom came in and suggested that we go outside and get some fresh air. My parents were relatively lenient and allowed us to go anywhere as long as it was in the complex. Unfortunately, Daniel and we pushed this rule today. We went outside and went down to the woods to do some exploring. We began by looking for turtles, snakes, and frogs. We couldn't find anything, so Daniel suggested to go through the flood drain and see if there was anything on the other side. The tunnel was dry since it had not rained in ages, so I was okay with it. I had been to the other side before and just led to a creek, and it was rather nice and secluded. So today we went through the tunnel like usual, and when we came out, there was a group of 4 sketchy-looking high school boys smoking. They saw us, and being a 3rd grader, I got nervous, so I will briefly describe them to make it easier to differentiate between the 4. One boy was chubby, one skinny, one was holding a speaker, and one had long hair, and looked like a stereotypical surfer. I'll call them Fat Boy, Skinny, DJ, and Surfer Boy. Upon seeing us, they dropped their cigarettes and started heading over to us. Fat Boy asked, "What do you guys think you're doing back here?" I was still really nervous, so Daniel did all the talking. Daniel said we were just exploring and seeing what we could find. They all nodded, and DJ asked if we want to have a rap battle. I didn't want to, but before I could say anything, Daniel says yes, and our troubles begin. DJ finds a beat on his phone while Skinny Boy and Daniel prepare to battle, and this is where it begins to go wrong. At first, it is rather harmless. Skinny Boy was a decent rapper, and Daniel was absolutely awful. Now, I forgot to mention that Daniel was kind of racist, and Fat Boy was black. At some point in Daniel's verse, he decides it's a good idea to include the N-word. Upon hearing this, Fat Boy calls out, "What did you just say?" Daniel now looks nervous and stutters that it just slipped out. I start grabbing Daniel and trying to leave through the tunnel when Skinny Boy grabs Daniel by the shirt collar and drags him closer to him. I begin to try to run away, like a little baby, to get my parents' help. DJ sees me trying to leave and pushes me hard, so I fall and eat it. After that, no one is focused on me, and they are all standing in a circle around Daniel. I continue running through the tunnel, out of the woods, up the hill, and into my apartment. I frantically burst inside and start tearing up and telling my parents that Daniel was in trouble with older boys. I was unable to articulate sentences because I was panicking, so it took 5 minutes for my parents to understand what was happening. After I finished telling them what had happened, my dad grabbed a baseball bat and went with me back through the tunnel. 15 minutes had passed at this point. My dad and I arrived to a horror scene. The 4 boys were all gone, and Daniel was lying in a bloody mess on the ground. He was knocked unconscious by the boys, and there was a tooth laying next to him. My dad quickly called 911 and attempted to explain the situation. I had to help out because my parents are foreign and struggle explaining things at times. After he explained what had happened, he told me to go up to the apartment and wait for help to arrive and lead them down to where Daniel was. We also called Daniel's parents to let them know what had happened. Luckily, we live in a relatively small town, so it took everyone around 10 minutes to arrive. I led everyone to the scene that had occurred behind the tunnel. When we got there, the paramedics got to work to get Daniel awake and treating his numerous injuries. Daniel barely regained consciousness eventually and was then led to the ambulance to be driven to the hospital with his parents. 2 police officers stayed behind with my parents and I to give us a lesson about being more strict and being careful in areas you think are safe. After everyone left, my parents did not even ground me because of the shock that I had just witnessed. After this, I never talked to Daniel again since his parents were so angry at my irresponsibility and my own parents' lack of care. He had also probably moved away since I had never seen him around at school. If anyone gets to this point in the story, I would ask for you to please be responsible, and if you are a parent, be strict on your child while they are young. They might not like a strict childhood growing up, but it is better to have a strict childhood than to have no childhood if it's prematurely ended by a tragedy. 2012 had a rocky start for me to say the least, and had I have known at the time that I was going to be using my Junker project car to save my life from someone I had hardly known, but who had been in my life for almost 13 years, I might have spent less time reading about and working on 3D art, and more time out working on the car or my own fitness. I, however, felt that having finished high school single and spent the following 5 years on failed dates, maybe once a year, that there was absolutely no reason to think anyone would want me around or to bother me, as I was a monster just under 280 pounds. Rob and I had become acquainted through school as far back as elementary school, but I had never really gotten to know him, often helping him out with bullies and such simply because I couldn't stand watching. I wasn't popular. Pretty much everyone, including the outcasts, left me alone. Even Rob did till late middle school, and it wasn't hard to see why. I always looked about ready to hurt someone, and when I wasn't, it usually meant I had fallen asleep in class. After graduation, as far as I was concerned, everyone moved on with their lives and grew up. Got jobs or died young partying, as word came up from time to time through social media. Rob's parents had apparently moved to Australia for 3 years and left Rob with the house. His uncle moved in to help with upkeep on bills and such. Rob himself had developed schizophrenia at some point shortly after graduation, brought to light by the passing of his grandfather. I wish someone had been able to tell me any of the above before he tried to drag me down with him. I would run into him from time to time at the mall or Walmart to GameStop, just regular places that didn't seem odd at all. For me, talking to him was somewhat of a break from my fairly boring life. This was the way of a small town. Rob had become a big guy, well-balanced in weight and height compared to the majority of our school years. His self-esteem was still shot, and he would always ask if I wanted to go drinking, but as conversations went on, would also ask if he could help me out with anything. He always asked these two things if we talked, no matter how short the conversation was. I always declined. At first, I thought he had outwardly started acting bi or gay and had taken a liking to me, so I avoided him whenever I could. I was bad at getting a date, and I'm straight, so turning down a guy wasn't exactly in my mindset anywhere. Spring of 2012, I went to a car meet to show off my new prize. Rob was there, but something was wrong. This was 2 states away from home, and he didn't own a vehicle yet. Looking back, it seems odd just how I knew this was off so soon, and how my gut told me trouble was brewing. He didn't approach me, though. He did watch, giving glances on occasion from where he stood. Before the meet ended, I decided I'd say hello, at least to be polite and see what he was up to. In a voice that was clearly not his, almost as if his mind had been someone else altogether, he said,
"That was messed up, and it's not going to be the last mistake either, I bet."
My head fell to my right shoulder, and my eyes were locked in confusion. "What?" I just said hello.
"Hello."
He mimicked in the same voice again. I turned away and brushed it off as him being childish. Maybe someone had already made him mad and he was just venting. Oh well, not a problem. The meet ends and I'm easily the 3rd or 4th one out. Rob had been sitting in a passenger of some Dodge Charger and looked to be now watching the owner waiting tiredly to be taken home. Skip ahead a few weeks, another meet. I show up late after getting off of work late. I'm going to see a restored Ford Falcon that this guy on the forums I joined had been posting progress pics of. There's someone standing around the car, and that's not the owner, it's Rob, and he's looking dead on at me as I walk up. He waits till I'm walking by him around the front of the car and lightly open-handed pushes my shoulder to get me to look back at him. The second I do, that mocking voice from last time's comes from him again.
Mistakes.
I'm losing my nerve because the voice doesn't sound to be a threat, but when I ask him what his deal is, it seems like I suddenly stop existing again. There's a guy next to me now, Travis. I know him because of his truck. You just can't miss it, the paint job's so out there. Hey, he's out of his head, just ignore it. It's not the first strange thing he's said tonight. Travis seems to have caught the look on my face and is trying to help, I guess. The evening ends. Everyone leaves but me. I stick around to enjoy the night sky and cool breeze. I'm in an empty lot on a mountainside for at least another 40 minutes before I finally leave. There's the Falcon about 20 or so miles back down the road towards town. It's sitting on the shoulder blinkers on, and Rob and the owner are both leaned on the car looking entirely bummed out. It ran out of gas and they both just finished arguing about whose fault that was. I offer to give them a lift to go get gas. The owner instead hands me a canister from the trunk and some money, insisting that they both need to watch the car as no chances I'm letting anything happen to it. As I leave, I hear them get on each other's cases and could almost swear for the first time ever actually hearing legit anger in the otherwise depressed, normal voice of Rob. I return to them. The owner is sitting in the car's driver's seat in a huff. Rob quickly nabs the canister from me and waves me off in an almost disgusted fashion. Maybe I should have taken the hint that Rob's mocking and such were a mental issue, but for whatever reason, I keep thinking it was just some misplaced anger. "Guys, sure you won't need any more help?" I ask. The owner starts to speak, but is cut off when Rob whirls his heels from filling the tank, and in a rage-filled scream says,
Always helpful, but never when needed, always a mistake. We don't need you.
I'm not about to fight with him or let him get any closer to me. Fighting Rob be about the dumbest thing I could do, as I was out of shape. He, on the other hand, was just a big guy, not muscular, but tough enough to take me out without a second thought. I wouldn't go to another car meet for a month. However, it'd be far from the last time I saw Rob. These next 2 visits would leave me helping him get home and the other running away from him with a dislocated shoulder. I had been out in town getting some supplies to build a new desk for my home office. On the way home, I had come across a gold Corolla sitting half off the road, its front end blown apart by an impact with a deer, and, never too far from predictable with my luck, Rob. He was down and clearly had been crying, sitting in front of his new totaled car holding his keys, mumbling about how bad his luck was. I didn't recognize him at first, and when he saw it was me, who had pulled up beside his car, his face turned from sad into a broken joy, clearly still broken but relieved. As he walked up to my window, the tow truck he had called showed up. He sternly asked for a lift home. After he directed me there, I dropped him off. The ride was silent aside from directions. He got out with a painful sigh and a thanks and went into a house where no lights were ever turned on, and I left. I had rented a small car garage to work in to be away from home so my family couldn't distract me from my work and so I could study my car, as I was using it for a reference to a 3D model I was making. It had been 2 months since I had last seen Rob or gone to a car meet, and summer was having a fit of heat waves, so instead of sitting at the computer, I was under the car doing minor repairs like a brake job. The only people who should have had any idea where I was or what I was doing would have been my parents and the shop owner Tom. However, when a hand gripped around my forearm and yanked me from under the car where I had been trying to see to undo a caliper bolt, the last person I ever expected to see was Rob.
"It's your fault,"
he said loudly and angrily, face to face with me as I tried to jerk free and to get to my feet. In a moment, getting to my feet would be the least of my worries. Rob had hoisted me up to my feet and raised a clenched fist.
"They always have to tell me it's your fault."
He swung with his right fist, his left hand still firmly grasped to my forearm. Seeing his fist already as he swung, I jumped. It did little to help, as the full blow went straight into my kneecap, and the force from me jumping caused him to stumble, sending both of us into the ground. I attempted to kick up to my feet once more, my right arm now held behind me in his grip from how he had fallen. Bad idea. I got up all right, but the force against his grip not only forced me back down, it also dislocated my shoulder. Pain. Pain was now screaming its way through my entire right arm, and I yelled out, which caused him to let go. He kicked me in the back as he got to his feet and reached for the jack nearby, swinging it on the ground at me as I rolled clean under the car and to the other side, getting to my feet.
"You're not. I can't. No, you'll make more mistakes, more trouble. Stop, stop, stop. He yelled and rushed around the side of the car, blocking my attempt to run out to the open bay door. Rob had the wrench I was using in his hand now and was just standing there enraged, glaring at me. I wasn't some pro fighter, but I wasn't going to waste time being chased around the car either. No more thinking. I ran at him and jumped, tossing all of me into him. Being overweight paid off with its one and only benefit. My weight knocked him down again and sent me tumbling over him towards the bay door. I got up, busted out the door in a sprint as the wrench flew by me, clashing against the asphalt, and I heard Rob yelling and running after me, but he tripped. I glanced for only a moment and made my way to my project junker car. I got in and turned the key, turned it over. Rob had got up and was coming at me, bending to grab the wrench again as he did. I turned the wheel hard and floored it. Whomp. It hit him waist level, and I slammed on the brakes, watching him bash against the hood and fall back onto the pavement, this time staying down, groveling in pain. Kicking the door open to make room, I frantically started trying to reach my phone in my right pocket, with my left arm to call the cops, and to the best of my ability, started running towards the owner's home. The yelling had caught Tom's attention, and he had seen everything that had happened outside of the garage. He was already on the phone with the police, and after reaching me, stayed between where Rob laid and where I sat until they arrived. After a hospital visit and a very fun session of let the interns do it, the police stopped by and informed me that with Tom's statement and my injuries it was clear what had happened. They also went on to tell me that Rob had recently been suspected of trying to attack another person, and had in fact beaten the Ford Falcon's owner the night I saw them. I have never seen Rob since then, and to the best of my knowledge he is currently being held in a mental institution somewhere in Pennsylvania, close to the family he has left here in the United States. I don't think there's some lesson I can give here or an explanation outside of his mental condition. All I would like to say at the end of this is, fight no matter what, even if it seems a hopeless fight. (2008) Francis Scott Key Mall. I'll never forget the day my instincts saved my friend. I had gone to the mall with my childhood friend Sarah. We had actually been catching up. I never had many friends in school, and in high school me and her never had the same classes, and life outside of school for me was mostly sleep. So this was as good a time as any for us to catch up. Sarah was petite, small, and skinny, but I'd never call her frail. I was a tall, heavy-set dude with a bad limp. She would often joke that she felt safer with me because I looked like a big, scary bear, and the limp made me look like a hardcore mother who always won. She knew I hated being seen as scary, but would often tease, and the small walk be no different. After about 2 hours of walking around, we had been leaving Hot Topic when I felt like I was being watched. Like we were being watched. I finally caught eye of some guy in sunglasses, a tan shirt, gray jacket, and black dress shoes looking at us from across the center of the mall. The most offsetting thing about him, he was clean-cut, clean-shaven, short black hair. Everything about him screamed official, but his clothes looked like he had grabbed them off the floor and tossed them on. At first I thought he was a cop in regular attire and that I had once again been falsely accused of stealing. Little background, the owner of the mall's Walden Books had taken a strong disliking to me after I accidentally busted their theft sensors 2 years prior by falling over onto one stupidly distracted talking to another person. But he never said anything nor got close to us to try and stop us. I decided I wanted to see what he was really up to and led us up into Sears, and sure enough he followed. I didn't tell Sarah about it, but made a decision. There was a hall to our left for restrooms down by the service bays and waiting room, and a good 12 or so feet ahead was electronics. I asked Sarah to wait for me by electronics while I went to the bathroom. There. Now I'd know for sure, as we had passed the hall, this would mean I'd have to turn around and walk towards him a bit, then down the hall. His pace slowed a bit when he saw us splitting up. I glared him down as I came his way and then turned down the hall, pretending to look at my phone, using it as a mirror. He clearly looked at me as his head turned, but he continued straight on past the hall. I turned into the bathroom doorway, and as soon as he was beyond view of the hall, I turned around. My turn, I muttered to myself and laughed a bit. I felt like a kid playing spy. I had guessed that this guy might notice me, so I came out of the hall and made my way towards tools. The tools section wasn't separated by any walls, but just by the walkway, giving me a clear view and cover behind toolboxes and shelves. He was following Sarah now, but still keeping a good distance. What annoyed me about this was Sarah never got the feeling of being watched or looked over like I had. In fact, both times she looked at him had only happened as turning to look around the store. Now I needed to know, but I wasn't going to cause a scene, or so I thought. I walked over from tools. Sarah saw me coming and joined me. We went back into the mall and then headed for a mall exit. Sarah had started to ask me why we weren't heading towards our cars, but a simple hand motion from me cut the question out. We walked outside. He was a considerable bit behind us, so I rushed us through the 2 sets of doors, giving them time to close. He walked to the edge of the overhang and stopped. I explained everything while pretending to look for cars, then turned around. In the area behind the doors, there he stood, and now he had no way to avoid both of us seeing him directly. We walked back in, and he had turned, standing against the sidewall. I now stood in front of him. "What's up, Chief?" I asked, mocking a cop, not a smart idea. But if he was a cop or even mall security, then he'd now have to call me out. He wouldn't look directly at either of us. "Gonna say I stole something? I've been minding my own business. How about you mind yours?" I was now projecting at him, but he said nothing, and even having raised my arms at him, he didn't move and didn't look at either of us. I opened the next door and waved Sarah through, stopping the door almost touching his face. Sarah had hurried on ahead. I stepped through, and the next few seconds remained frozen in my mind. He sighed, almost as if relieved I hadn't hit him with the door. I walked in and took a slow pace. Sure enough, he followed. However, he hadn't noticed that I was now walking backwards. I backed right into him, and my upper arm caught the feeling of a holster under his arm as we bumped into each other. In Maryland at the time, concealed carry by civilians wasn't legal. I now knew something was entirely out of place. I was angry, but I was also lucky as mall security rounded the corner to exit. "Gun! He's got a gun!" I yelled. He backed away from me as mall security came running up with a taser drawn. "She's lucky you're so annoying," he muttered as he continued back towards the exit, and mall security followed. I didn't stick around to find out anything. I ran for Sarah, grabbed her wrists, and took off through the mall towards the security office. The head of security in the office was not exactly thrilled to see me, but was aware of what had gone on. Apparently they had been watching since we entered Sears, and the tape showed them that this man had been following Sarah since she parked, and had actually only started to try to hide himself when she met up with me. The most unreal part of all of this, though, they caught him but released him when he produced an official government ID and number. To me, I don't care if he was God himself. This isn't the type of behavior you just let slide. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.